Hello guys, welcome to Eldritch Potter. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Griphook found baby Harry bleeding at age 3 and blood ritual exposed Dumbledore selling his inheritance to Dark Lords? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The rain had been falling since midday, and by 9 in the evening it had settled into the kind of steady, miserable pour that made the street lamps on Privet Drive look like they were drowning. Number 4 sat identical to every other house on the street, neat hedges, clean driveway, the faint blue flicker of a television behind drawn curtains. Nothing to suggest that anything inside it was worth a second glance. Griphook stood at the garden gate and thought it was the most aggressively ordinary house he had ever seen. He was young, as goblins went, barely past his 40th year, which put him somewhere between a junior clerk and a mid-level accounts officer in the labyrinthine hierarchy of Gringotts Bank. He had sharp cheekbones, sharper eyes, and the kind of humorless mouth that made wizards nervous when they sat across from him at a vault review. His robes were dark green, slightly damp at the hem, and he was holding a leather satchel that contained 3 things: a copy of the Potter Vault Ledger, a goblin-sealed writ of financial inquiry, and a brass instrument called a sanguine compass that hadn't been used officially in about 200 years. He hadn't wanted to bring the compass. His supervisor Brackneck had insisted. "Something in the ledger is wrong," Brackneck had said that morning, dropping the file on Griphook's desk with the kind of practiced disinterest that meant it was actually very interesting indeed. "The disbursement records don't match the authorization signatures. Someone's been pulling from the Potter secondary accounts using instruments that should have required blood confirmation. Find out what's happening." It should have been simple. A quick trip to verify addresses, cross-reference signatures, file a discrepancy report. Griphook had handled a dozen of these. Wealthy wizarding families with complicated estates were forever losing track of who had authorized what, and the paperwork tangle usually took 3 days and a mild argument to sort out. He hadn't expected the compass to start spinning the moment he stepped off the night bus 2 streets over. It was spinning now, its brass needle pulled hard toward number 4 like a dog straining at a leash, and the small red indicator at its base, the one that Griphook had privately assumed was decorative, was glowing with a steady, pulsing light that made something cold settle in the pit of his stomach. He knew what that light meant. He'd read about it in the bank's oldest operational manuals, the ones kept in the sub-basement archive behind a door that required a senior officer's key. Blood in distress. Active. Recent. He pushed the gate open. The doorbell produced a cheerful 2-note chime that was deeply at odds with the rain and the spinning compass and the cold feeling that kept getting colder. Griphook waited. 30 seconds. He rang again. The door opened to a large man in a mustard-colored dressing gown, with a thick neck and a face that managed to be simultaneously fleshy and pinched, as though his features had been squeezed inward by years of disapproving of things. He looked down at Griphook, and most people looked down at Griphook, with the particular expression of a man who had decided to be annoyed before he'd even seen who was there. "We don't want any," Vernon Dursley said, and began to close the door. "Mr. Dursley." Griphook's voice was not loud, but it had a quality that made people stop. Years of vault negotiations had honed it into something precise and unignorable, like a key turning in a lock. "My name is Griphook. I am a senior financial officer of Gringotts Bank, and I am here on a matter of urgent legal inquiry concerning the estate of James and Lily Potter. I suggest you open the door fully." Something moved behind Vernon's eyes. Something that looked, to Griphook's experienced gaze, very much like guilt. "There's no one here by that name," Vernon said. "Wrong house." The compass in Griphook's satchel pulsed against the leather, warm even through the material. Griphook looked at Vernon Dursley for a long moment, then reached into his satchel and produced the writ of inquiry, a roll of heavy parchment sealed with Gringotts gold and printed with the bank's crest, which had a tendency to make wizards go pale and muggles go very still. He held it up. "This writ grants me right of entry and examination under the International Statute of Wizarding Finance, Article 17, which predates your Ministry of Magic by approximately 6 centuries and supersedes its jurisdiction in matters of blood-held accounts. I don't need your permission to enter, Mr. Dursley." I'm offering you the courtesy of opening your own door. Vernon's jaw worked. Behind him, a thin blonde woman appeared at the end of the hallway, clutching her own dressing gown closed and staring at Griphook with an expression of pure, reflexive horror. "Vernon," she said in a tight whisper. "Don't make a scene." The door opened. The house smelled of furniture polish and something fried, and every surface Griphook passed was relentlessly clean in a way that felt less like tidiness and more like erasure, as though the Dursleys were perpetually trying to scrub away evidence of something. Family photographs covered one wall of the sitting room, a large blonde boy at various ages, always center frame, always grinning with the particular smugness of a child who has never been told no. Griphook noted there was not a single photograph that included a dark-haired child. He noted this the way he noted everything, quietly, precisely, and with growing interest. "What do you want?" Vernon demanded, planting himself in the middle of the sitting room with his arms crossed. He was trying to look authoritative. He looked, Griphook thought, like a man standing in front of a door. "I want to see the boy," Griphook said simply. "Harry Potter. He is registered as a dependent residing at this address under a guardianship arrangement that was filed with Gringotts 3 years ago. I need to confirm his welfare status as part of my inquiry." "He's asleep," Petunia said immediately. "He's perfectly fine, he's just..." The compass pulsed again, harder this time, and the red light shifted to something deeper, almost amber. Griphook's hand tightened on the satchel strap. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way that a room goes quiet before something breaks. "The instrument I am carrying is reacting to the presence of a blood claim heir in distress. It does not react to sleeping children. I will ask you once more, where is Harry Potter?" The silence stretched. Petunia's eyes went to a door under the staircase, just a flick, barely a second, but Griphook had spent 40 years reading people across negotiating tables, and he caught it like a coin from the air. He walked to the cupboard door without another word. It was locked with a deadbolt and a sliding latch, both of them on the outside. Griphook stood there for a moment, looking at those two locks, and something happened behind his sharp eyes that he would not have described as emotion. Goblins, by professional custom, did not have emotions during working hours, but which was, in fact, a very particular kind of fury. The quiet kind. The kind that stays. He slid the latch. Turned the bolt. Opened the door. The cupboard was small and dark and smelled of must and old shoes. A bare mattress took up most of the floor space, thin enough that the boards beneath it were visible through the fabric. On the mattress, curled on his side with his knees drawn up, was a child. He was tiny. Even accounting for the fact that he was 3 years old, he was tiny, underfed in a way that showed at the wrists and the sharp angle of his shoulder blades, which were visible because his shirt was too small and had ridden up. His hair was a dark tangle, sticking up in multiple directions at once, and his face, when Griphook leaned down to see it, was smudged with dust and dried tears and something that might have been tomato sauce from a meal that had probably been smaller than it should have been. He was asleep, but it was the sleep of exhaustion rather than peace, even unconscious. His brow was slightly furrowed, and his small hands were curled into fists at his chest. The compass was vibrating now, not just pulsing, a fine tremor running through the brass casing, and the light had gone fully amber and was edging towards something that Griphook did not want to see it become. He crouched down and gently moved the too small shirt aside to look at the child's back. For clean welts, raised and red, running diagonally from left shoulder to right hip. Not severe enough to require a healer immediately, but fresh, the redness hadn't begun to fade, and deliberate. No child got marks like that from a fall. Griphook sat back on his heels and breathed through his nose for a moment. Then he opened his satchel and took out the sanguine compass. The procedure for an emergency blood rights assessment was outlined in Chapter 9 of Gringotts Operational Charter, subsection 12, paragraph 4, and Griphook had read it once during his training as something between a historical curiosity and a theoretical exercise. The practice dated back to the Goblin Wars, a method of confirming the identity and legal status of wounded heirs when documentation had been destroyed or withheld. It required the assessor to draw a single drop of blood from the heir's fingertip using a goblin silver needle, touch it to the center compass dial, and speak the verification phrase in high gobbledygook. It was considered an extreme measure. The charter was very clear that it required documented justification. Griphook looked at the welts on the child's back. He thought that would probably constitute justification. He took the silver needle from its velvet case in the satchel. Gently, without waking the boy, he pricked the pad of one small index finger, barely a touch. The needle was almost impossibly fine, and a single dark bead of blood welled up, almost black in the dim light from the hallway. Griphook pressed the compass dial against it. The child stirred but didn't wake. Griphook spoke the phrase. It was 7 words in high gobbledygook, the oldest form of his language, the kind that didn't just communicate meaning but compelled truth from whatever it touched. The compass didn't just react. It exploded. Not literally, though for one lurching second Griphook's hand jerked back as if it might. The brass casing rang like a struck bell, a clear note that filled the cupboard and vibrated up through the floorboards, and then every gauge on the compass face spun simultaneously, needle whipping around to maximum range before slamming to a stop. The amber light went white. Then it went gold, a deep, saturated gold that cast the inside of the cupboard in warm light and made the child's face, still sleeping, look like something from an illuminated manuscript. The ledger in Griphook's satchel fell open on its own. He grabbed it, and in the white gold light he read what the blood had unlocked, because that was what a positive blood rights assessment did, in extreme cases. It opened the full estate record. Everything the heir was owed. Everything that had ever been held, transferred, sold, or removed from the Potter accounts. The list went on for 11 pages. Griphook sat cross-legged on the floor of the cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive, and read for 12 minutes without moving. The child slept beside him. Behind him, at the end of the hallway, Vernon Dursley was breathing heavily, waiting to be told this was all a mistake and the strange creature would leave. By the time Griphook reached page 7, his hands were very still. By page 9, his jaw was tight. By page 11, he closed the ledger with a quiet, precise snap and sat for a moment looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man who has just found exactly what he came looking for and wishes, distantly, that he hadn't. The Potter estate had been systematically drained across a period of 3 years, beginning within weeks of the Potters' deaths. Secondary accounts had been accessed using instruments of wardship, legal tools that required proof of guardianship and, technically, blood authorization, though the blood authorization records in the file were dated after the transactions, not before, which was not how blood authorization worked and which suggested someone had been filing paperwork to retroactively cover a trail. Artifacts from the Potter family vault had been removed and transferred to 3 separate holding accounts, 2 of which were registered to parties Griphook didn't immediately recognize and one of which, his finger had stopped on the page at this, was registered to an individual operating under the pseudonym APWBD. Potter family seats on the Wisengamot, hereditary political positions that carried actual voting weight, had been quietly resigned on Harry's behalf, their influence effectively redistributed. Ancient magical contracts, the kind that families like the Potters accumulated over centuries of alliances and favors, had been sold or voided. The guardianship filing that had placed Harry at this address was signed by Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. APWBD Griphook stood up. He was not a tall figure in the narrow cupboard doorway, but something about the way he stood made him seem larger than he was, the way a blade seems larger when it's unsheathed. He turned to the boy on the mattress and crouched down again, this time to wake him. He did it carefully, a gentle touch on the shoulder, calling his name quietly, because he had read enough of the file to know that this child had reason to wake badly, and Griphook was not, whatever else he was, cruel. Harry Potter opened his eyes. They were very green, extraordinarily green, the kind of color that didn't seem entirely natural, and there was a scar above his right brow that the compass had also registered, a faint magical resonance still attached to it like a radio signal that wouldn't quite tune out. He looked at Griphook with the particular wariness of a small child who has learned that waking up sometimes means something bad is about to happen. "Hello, Griphook said, in English, with none of his usual professional crispness. He was not sure when he had decided to modulate his tone, but something in the way those green eyes were watching him had made it seem necessary. My name is Griphook. I work at a bank. Are you Harry? A pause. The boy's eyes moved past Griphook to the open cupboard door, checking the hallway, checking where the Dursleys were. Even at 3, he was cataloguing exits and dangers, and something about that made the quiet fury in Griphook's chest burn a little hotter. Yes, Harry said. His voice was small and a bit hoarse, as though he wasn't used to speaking much. Are you going to get Uncle Vernon? No, Griphook said. I'm going to get you out of here. Harry looked at him for a long moment, 3 years old and already calculating the reliability of a promise, and then he sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at the welts on his back, and Griphook had to do something deliberate and effortful with his face to keep it neutral. Okay, Harry said simply. Vernon Dursley was standing in the hallway when Griphook came out of the cupboard with Harry held carefully against his shoulder. The boy was light, too light, the weight of him more proof than any ledger entry, and Vernon's face had gone through several colors before settling on a deep, blotchy red. You can't just take him, Vernon said. He lives here. Dumbledore said, Dumbledore, Griphook said, and the name came out of his mouth with a precision that made Vernon stop talking, does not own this child. This child owns himself, and the legal instruments governing his welfare are held by Gringotts Bank under a blood rights charter that supersedes any private arrangement made by a private individual, regardless of how many titles that individual holds. He reached into his satchel one-handed and produced a second roll of parchment, the one he hadn't used yet, the emergency custodial removal writ that Brackneck had included at the bottom of the file with a note that said probably won't need this. This is a Gringotts emergency custodial removal order. It is legally binding under the same charter I mentioned at the door. I suggest you read it, but the relevant section is paragraph 2, which states that obstructing the execution of this order is classified as interference with a blood rights heir and carries penalties that will make your mortgage look like a rounding error. He walked past Vernon Dursley without pausing. Petunia was in the kitchen doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. She made a sound when she saw Harry, something that Griphook couldn't interpret cleanly, something that might have been guilt or might have been fear, and which was probably, he decided, both. Harry didn't look at her. He had tucked his face against Griphook's shoulder in a way that suggested he'd already said everything he needed to say about this house, and all of it was in that gesture. The bank will be in contact, Griphook told them both, and he walked out the front door into the rain, the compass warm in his satchel and the ledger heavy at his hip and a 3-year-old heir of an ancient wizarding family clinging to his shoulder, and by the time he reached the garden gate the red light on the compass had gone out entirely. The gold one was still glowing. He stood under the rain for a moment, adjusting Harry's weight against his shoulder and thinking through the logistics of what came next. The boy's breathing had slowed and deepened, he was already sliding back toward sleep against Griphook's neck, with the uncomplicated trust of a child who had decided once to trust a thing and was committing to it fully. Griphook was not sentimental. He was aware of that about himself. He did not make decisions based on feeling. He also did not, as a matter of professional practice, leave blood rights heirs in cupboards under staircases. And the ledger. And the welts. And the way Harry had looked at the hallway before he'd said a single word. Gringotts, Griphook said quietly, addressing the compass. He spoke a location phrase in gobbledygook, the same way you might dial a telephone. Emergency transit. Subdirector clearance. The compass pulsed gold twice. Acknowledged. Good, said Griphook, and walked into the side alley beside number 4, Privet Drive, and then both of them were gone, and the rain fell on an empty street, and the Dursleys stood in their neat hallway and did not call anyone, because they were not entirely sure who they were more frightened of, the bank, or what the bank might find out. The transit brought them into Gringotts through the sub-level entrance, a broad stone corridor lit with phosphorescent crystals that cast everything in pale blue-white light. Emergency transit arrivals were rare enough that 2 security officers were already waiting, tall goblins in full armor, spears grounded, and they looked at Griphook and the sleeping child with identical expressions of controlled surprise. "Senior Officer Griphook," the left one said. "Brackneck is expecting you." "Brackneck can wait 10 minutes, Griphook said, moving past them. "I need a healer and a warm room." The healer's name was Goldthorn, and she was brisk and thorough and said nothing at all about the welts except to clean and seal them with a silver compound that smelled of copper and sage, and when she was finished she covered Harry with a blanket that was heavy enough to actually constitute blanket rather than suggestion, and Harry slept on through all of it without waking, deeply and completely, the way children sleep when they have finally been put somewhere safe. Griphook watched from the doorway, the ledger in his hands, and thought about what came next. There was a protocol for this. There was a protocol for everything at Gringotts, and the protocol for a blood rights heir in custodial emergency was clear: notification of subdirector, immediate account freeze pending investigation, formal filing with the Gringotts Financial Oversight Committee. Clean, orderly, bureaucratic. The problem was that the Financial Oversight Committee's current liaison to Gringotts was a ministry appointment, and the Ministry of Magic's most prominent external advisor on matters of law and governance was Albus Dumbledore, which meant that filing with the Oversight Committee was approximately the same as filing directly with the person Griphook needed to investigate. He went back to his office instead, lit the lamp, and opened the ledger again. The list of transfers was extensive, but Griphook had a particular talent for financial architecture, for seeing the shape beneath the numbers, the logic or deliberate illogic, of how money and assets moved between accounts. He had made the bank a considerable amount of gold over his career by spotting patterns that other officers missed, and he sat now at his desk in the early hours of the morning and let the ledger tell him its story. The Potter family had been wealthy, not ostentatiously so, not by the standards of houses like Black or Malfoy, but comfortably and meaningfully wealthy in ways that went beyond galleons. They had vault holdings, yes. The primary vault alone had contained enough to fund Harry through multiple lifetimes. But the deeper wealth was structural. 14 hereditary seats of influence across Wizarding Britain, some of them so old they predated the Wizengamot itself. A collection of magical artifacts that had been in the family since the early medieval period, including at least 3 items that the ledger flagged as restricted classification, powerful enough that even Gringotts handled them with specific protocols. Alliance contracts with 6 other major families, binding magical agreements that carried real power in the political landscape of Wizarding Britain. Property holdings across 3 countries. Research endowments at 2 institutions. And then there was the really interesting part. Beginning in November 1981, 3 weeks after the Potters' deaths, before the bodies were cold, a pattern of authorized withdrawals began. Small at first. A single artifact transferred to a holding account. A minor property deed signed over. Easy to miss in a large estate, easy to dismiss as administrative cleanup. But Griphook followed the thread forward and the withdrawals grew, larger, faster, more frequent. By the end of 1982, 4 of the 14 Wizengamot seats had been resigned. By early 1983, the artifact collection had been almost entirely dispersed. The authorization signatures were meticulous. That was what made it interesting. Someone had been very careful, too careful, in a way that itself became a pattern. Every transaction had documentation. Every documentation had a signature. Every signature was valid. But the blood authorization records, the ones required for the highest level transfers, the ones that should have contained actual biological confirmation, were all dated slightly wrong. Hours off. Sometimes days. Always after the transaction, never before. Which meant someone had authorized major transfers, then filed the blood confirmations to cover them retroactively. Blood confirmations for a child who had been placed with Muggles who had no access to goblin banking facilities and no conceivable way to provide authorized biological confirmation. Forged, then. Or falsified. Which in goblin banking law was not merely fraud, it was desecration. It violated the oldest principle of goblin financial practice, the one that predated every written charter, that blood was the most sacred form of contract, and to falsify it was to commit a crime against the foundation of the system itself. Griphook stared at the page for a long time. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment, dipped his quill, and began to write. Not the standard discrepancy report. Not the oversight committee notification. He was writing to Ragnarok, the high director of Gringotts, a figure so senior that most of the bank staff never had reason to address him directly, and he was writing a letter that began, Sir, I believe I have uncovered evidence of systematic fraud against a blood rights minor that implicates one of the most powerful figures in wizarding Britain, and I require a meeting at your earliest convenience. He signed it, sealed it with his personal seal, and sent it with the bank's overnight courier system. Then he went back to the healer's room and sat in the chair beside Harry's bed, the ledger in his lap, and waited for morning. Harry woke at dawn, when the crystal lights shifted their color cycle from night blue to a warmer white. He lay still for a moment, the way children do when they're in an unfamiliar place, processing with his eyes before his body moved, and then he saw Griphook in the chair and something in his small face settled. You're still here, Harry said. Not surprised, exactly, but like he'd expected the other possibility. I'm still here, Griphook confirmed. How does your back feel? Harry thought about this with the focused seriousness of a child who has been asked a real question and intends to give a real answer. Better, he said. It doesn't sting anymore. The healer put something on it. Oh. Harry sat up, looking around the room with wide eyes. The healer's chamber was cut from the same dark stone as the rest of the lower bank levels, but it was warm, and the blanket on the bed was a deep burgundy that seemed rich and enormous against Harry's small frame. Are we underground? Yes. This is Gringotts Bank. The bank your family uses. Harry processed this. My mum and dad had a bank. They had many things, Griphook said carefully. Which is partly why I'm here. The green eyes moved to the ledger in Griphook's lap. Children were perceptive in ways adults consistently underestimated, and Harry Potter, even at 3, even underfed and newly extracted from a cupboard, had eyes that noticed things. Is that about me? It's about your family. Which is about you, yes. Is it bad? Griphook considered this. Lying to children was, in his experience, efficient in the short term and catastrophically counterproductive in the long term. Some of it is, he said. But the fact that I found it means we can do something about it. That's what I do. I find problems and I fix them. Harry looked at him steadily for a moment. Then, you're not like other grown-ups. Griphook thought about Vernon Dursley in his mustard dressing gown, and about the authorization signatures in the ledger, and about the particular way that grown-ups, in positions of authority over this child had conducted themselves to date. No, he said. I'm not. Harry seemed to find this satisfactory. He pulled the burgundy blanket around his shoulders like a cape and looked around the room with the particular focused curiosity of a child who is deciding to be interested in something instead of afraid of it, and Griphook watched him and thought that whoever James and Lily Potter had been, whatever choices had led to their deaths and the catastrophic mismanagement of their estate, they had apparently managed to produce a child of remarkable character. Which made what had been done to him considerably worse. An hour later, Griphook was in Brackneck's office. His supervisor was a broad, gray-skinned goblin of middle age who communicated primarily through varying configurations of controlled impassivity, and he listened to Griphook's account of the previous night with his hands folded on the desk and his expression absolutely neutral. When Griphook finished and placed the ledger open on the desk between them, Brackneck looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to page 9. Then to page 11. APWBD, he said. Yes, sir. You're certain. The blood rights assessment confirmed identity. The authorization records confirm the pattern. The timestamps on the blood confirmations are, I can see the timestamps, Griphook. Brackneck closed the ledger with a care that itself communicated something. He sat back. You understand what you're saying? I do. You're accusing the most powerful wizard in Britain of defrauding a blood rights minor. Of falsifying goblin financial records. Of selling assets belonging to a protected heir without legal authorization. I'm not accusing him, Griphook said. The ledger is. I'm just reading it. A pause. Brackneck looked at the ceiling, which was the goblin equivalent of a long, slow exhale. The child is here. In the healer's chamber. And you filed an emergency custodial removal order with the Muggles. I did. Which means the Ministry will find out within 48 hours that we have the Potter heir in our custody, because someone in that household will talk to someone, and someone will talk to the Ministry, and the Ministry will talk to, which is why I've already written to Ragnarok, Griphook said. Brackneck went very still. You wrote to the High Director. Last night. Before I went back to sit with the boy. The pause this time was long enough that Griphook counted 12 seconds in his head. Brackneck was not a man, goblin, who was easily surprised, but the slight flare of his nostrils and the infinitesimal widening of his eyes were, in Brackneck's lexicon, approximately equivalent to anyone else falling off their chair. You understand, Brackneck said slowly, that if you're wrong about any part of this, I'm not wrong about the child in the cupboard, Griphook said, and his voice was steady and clean as polished metal. Whatever else is disputed, I am not wrong about that. Brackneck looked at him for a moment. Then he reached across the desk and picked up the ledger again, carefully, and began to read from page 1. Sit down, he said. We're going to be here a while. By mid-morning, 2 more senior officers had been pulled into the room. By noon, Brackneck had drafted a preliminary investigation brief. By early afternoon, a reply had come back from Ragnarok's office, brief, written in high gobbledygook on paper so heavy it felt carved, that said only, tomorrow. Sunrise. Bring everything. Bring the child. Griphook returned to the healer's chamber to find Harry sitting cross-legged in the middle of the bed, engaged in a concentrated game that appeared to involve arranging several small copper coins, gold thorns, from the look of the healer's expression, into increasingly complex geometric patterns and then touching them one at a time to see which arrangement held together. The coins were glowing faintly at the edges in a color that was not copper. Goldthorn looked up when Griphook entered, made a face that said this has been happening for an hour, and made a gesture that said please don't ask me to explain it. Griphook crouched beside the bed to look at the coins. The arrangement Harry had built was a hexagonal spiral, each coin angled slightly differently from the ones around it, and the glow at the edges was a quiet, pulsing gold, not the compass gold, something different, something intrinsic. Ambient magic, expressing itself in a toddler through the path of least resistance. What are you building? Griphook asked. It has to balance, Harry said seriously, turning a coin 45 degrees with one finger. The glow intensified very slightly. When it balances it lights up right. And when it doesn't balance, it falls down. Harry touched the center coin and the whole arrangement held, the glow steadying to a warm consistent light. See? I see, Griphook said. He sat back on his heels, looking at the light. Ambient magical expression in an untrained child was not unusual. Ambient magical expression in a 3-year-old that was this controlled, this intentional, that was something else entirely. We have a meeting tomorrow morning. You'll come with me. Harry looked up from the coins. Who with? Someone important. His name is Ragnarok. He's in charge of the bank. The whole bank? The whole bank. Harry considered this. What do I need to do? Be yourself, Griphook said, which was either excellent advice or terrible advice depending on what Ragnarok made of a 3-year-old with glowing coins and a blood rights claim against the headmaster of Hogwarts, and Griphook had spent a significant portion of the afternoon wondering which way that would go. Okay, Harry said, and went back to his coins. That evening, after Goldthorn had fed Harry, a real meal, which the boy ate with the focused appreciation of someone who is very hungry and is also trying hard not to let on how hungry they are, and after he'd fallen asleep again, Griphook spread the ledger out on the floor of the healer's antechamber and worked through the rest of the entries methodically. The artifact transfers were catalogued on page 6. Most of them had gone to the 2 unidentified holding accounts, and Griphook made a note to have those accounts traced through the bank's identification protocols, it would take time, but Gringotts had methods of backtracking account registrations that the ministry had never been able to duplicate. Some of the artifacts had individual designations in the ledger, described in the Potter family's own record-keeping system rather than standardized banking terminology, and these were interesting. The cloak, restricted, sovereign, which was flagged in the original ledger 3 times with the notation not to be transferred under any circumstances, and which appeared in the transfer records anyway, removed to one of the unidentified accounts in February 1982. Alliance contract, House Black, see subcategory 7B. Griphook flipped to subcategory 7B and found that the Black Family Alliance contract, a centuries-old document that entitled the Potter heir to certain protections and considerations from the Black family, and vice versa, had been formally voided in January 1982. Voided, not sold. Simply declared null. Someone had decided it was inconvenient for Harry Potter to have the legal protection of the Black family. There was one more item that Griphook kept returning to, on page 10, which he'd read 3 times already and was now reading a 4th time. It was the most recent entry in the ledger, dated 6 months ago, mid-1983, and it read simply, Contact, House Lestrange, holding account R7. Transferred, binding protection voiding instrument, Potter bloodline, primary. Value listed, not commercially assessed. Nature, dark application. He read that last phrase again. Dark application. Gringotts did not, as a matter of policy, apply moral judgments to financial transactions. The bank held money for dark wizards and light wizards and everything in between, and it was not in the business of evaluation. But even Gringotts had a line, encoded in the charter centuries ago, and it was this: no transaction involving a blood rights minor could be classified as dark application. Ever. The protection of heirs was absolute. Not a guideline. Not a principle. An absolute. Whatever had been transferred to House Lestrange's holding account was something that acted on Harry Potter's bloodline and had a dark magical application, and it had been sold to Lestrange. Griphook closed the ledger. He sat in the quiet stone antechamber with the crystal lights cycling slowly toward their night setting and thought about what kind of person sold a dark instrument targeted at the bloodline of a 3-year-old orphan. He thought about what APWBD stood for, and what reasons a person might have, and what greater good was supposed to mean when it came with a ledger like this attached to it. He thought about the glowing coins and the balance point and the child sleeping in the next room who had already, in one day, decided to trust him, had made that decision the way you make a decision when you don't have the luxury of being wrong. Griphook picked up his quill. He turned to the blank page at the back of the notes he'd been keeping all day and wrote a new heading at the top, in his own neat hand, what was taken, and from whom. Then underneath it, smaller, what will be returned. Then he wrote until midnight, and by the time he set down the quill he had a document that was 13 pages long, precise and damning and cold as the gold in the vaults below, and he folded it and sealed it with his personal seal and placed it in the satchel beside the ledger and the compass and the writ of inquiry and the emergency custodial removal order. In the morning, they would go to Ragnarok. Whatever came after that was going to be considerably more complicated than a discrepancy report. But Griphook had found the problem, and he knew what the problem was, and he had the evidence in his hands and the heir asleep 10 feet away, and he was not, whatever else could be said about him, a person who found a problem and then quietly filed it away. The gold light on the compass pulsed once, softly, from inside the satchel, the way a candle flame moves when someone breathes near it, and Griphook looked at it and thought, with a clarity that he recognized as the feeling of a decision fully made, let's see what Albus Dumbledore says when the ledger starts talking. Chapter 2, The Weight of Gold. Ragnarok did not look like someone who ran the most powerful financial institution in the wizarding world. He looked like someone who had been running it for so long that the institution had started to resemble him, ancient, unhurried, and possessed of a stillness that made everything around it seem slightly frantic by comparison. He was old even by goblin standards, his face a topography of deep lines and sharper angles, his eyes the color of old iron, and he sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of black granite that was roughly the size of a small carriage and gave the impression of having grown there naturally. He looked at Harry for a long time when Griphook brought him in. Harry looked back. Most people, when Ragnarok looked at them, found something else to be interested in fairly quickly. Harry sat in the chair across the enormous desk. It was too large for him, his feet didn't reach the floor, and met the High Director's iron gaze with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who had learned to read faces the way other children learn to read books. "You found him in a cupboard," Ragnarok said. He was speaking to Griphook but watching Harry. "Under the stairs," Griphook confirmed. Both bolts were on the outside. Ragnarok's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, a settling, like a mountain deciding to become more mountain. "And the compass triggered before you knocked." "Before I reached the gate." Ragnarok looked at the ledger on his desk, which he had apparently read completely in the time between receiving Griphook's letter and this meeting, because he turned to specific pages without searching. He turned to page 10 and looked at the Lestrange entry. He turned to page 6 and looked at the item flagged not to be transferred under any circumstances. He turned back to the front and looked at the opening transaction record, November 1981, and the authorization signature, and the date of the blood confirmation that was filed 3 days after the transaction it was supposed to authorize. Then he put the ledger down and looked at Harry again. "Young man," he said, and his voice in direct address was a different instrument than the one he used to speak across Griphook, measured, deliberate, the kind of voice that was accustomed to every word mattering. "Do you know why you're here?" "Griphook found some things that were taken from my family," Harry said. He had been thinking about this, clearly, because there was no hesitation. "And now we're going to sort it out." Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. "Sort it out," he repeated. "Yes." Another pause. Griphook watched the High Director watching Harry and thought he recognized the particular quality of the silence. It was the silence of someone revising their expectations upward. "Your family has a vault here," Ragnarok said. "Several, actually. The primary vault has been untouched. The secondary accounts are where the discrepancies appear." "Do you know what a vault is?" "It's where you keep things safe," Harry said. "Except someone got in." "Yes." Ragnarok's finger rested on the ledger. "Someone with the keys." Harry's brow furrowed. "How did they get the keys?" "They were given them," Ragnarok said, "by someone who said they were acting on your behalf." "But they were not." The green eyes went very sharp. "Who?" Ragnarok looked at Griphook. This was, Griphook reflected, the moment he'd been thinking about since midnight. There was a reasonable argument, Brackneck had made it, twice, on the walk up to Ragnarok's floor, that you did not tell a 3-year-old the name of the person who had robbed him. That it was information a child couldn't use, that it would be handled by adults, by institutions, by processes. That the child should be kept comfortable and uninformed until the legal structure was ready. Griphook had listened to this argument and then walked past it. "His name is Albus Dumbledore," Griphook said, watching Harry's face. "He's a very powerful wizard. He was a friend of your parents." Harry took this in. The furrowed brow deepened, and then something happened in those green eyes, not the shock or confusion that a child might reasonably be expected to show, but something quieter and colder, a kind of recalibration, like a compass needle swinging to find true north. "He put me with Uncle Vernon," Harry said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And he took our things." "Yes." "Why?" Griphook looked at the ledger. "That's what we're going to find out." Ragnarok let the silence sit for a moment. Then he said, "I've authorized a blood rights tribunal. It will convene in 3 days. In the meantime, the Potter accounts are frozen, nothing in, nothing out, no further transactions of any kind without this office's direct authorization. The investigation will be conducted under Charter 9 authority, which means the Ministry of Magic has no jurisdiction over our findings or our conclusions." He paused. "This will not remain quiet, however. Griphook, the Muggle family, how much do they know? They know I took him under a custodial removal writ. They know the writ referenced the Potter accounts." Dursley had enough self-preservation instinct not to ask detailed questions. Griphook paused. He'll talk to someone eventually. People like that always do. How long? A week. Perhaps 2, if he's frightened enough. Then we have a week. Ragnarok picked up the ledger and handed it back to Griphook with the finality of someone returning a weapon to its owner. In the meantime, the boy needs quarters. Not the healer's ward, proper quarters. He'll be here for some time. He looked at Harry again. Would you like to stay here? Harry looked around the office, the black granite walls, the crystal lights, the city of shelves behind Ragnarok's chair, each shelf loaded with ledgers and sealed cases, the deep hum of the vault systems far below. He looked like someone who was performing a genuine assessment rather than waiting for permission to answer. Yes, he said. Can I see the vaults? Ragnarok made a sound that, coming from anyone else, Griphook might have called a laugh. In time, he said. You have your family's instincts, at least. What were they like? Harry asked. My family. Ragnarok looked at him steadily. Your father was bold and occasionally reckless, and he was loyal in a way that cost him more than it should have. Your mother was brilliant, and she asked better questions than anyone who ever sat in that chair. A pause. She would have had 12 more questions by now. Harry thought about this. I have 12 more questions, he said. I know, said Ragnarok. We'll answer them. Come back in 3 days. The quarters they gave Harry were on the 7th level, which was where Gringotts housed its small population of long-term residents, mostly goblin families of senior officers, with 2 rooms currently used by clients in extended legal disputes who had opted to remain on-site rather than navigate the complications of the outside world. Harry's room was small and warm, with stone walls hung with tapestries that showed goblin history in dense geometric patterns, a bed that actually fit him, a writing desk, and a window that looked not out onto a street. They were deep underground, but into an interior atrium where phosphorescent plants grew in elaborate arrangements and the air smelled faintly of water and minerals. Griphook showed him around it and expected questions about when he could leave, about school, about food, about any of the 100 practical concerns a 3-year-old newly installed in a goblin bank might reasonably raise. Instead, Harry stood in the middle of the room and looked at the tapestries. What do they say? He asked. They tell the history of goblin civilization, Griphook said. In a condensed form. Can you teach me to read them? Griphook paused. It's in gobbledygook. It takes years to learn properly. I don't have anything else to do, Harry pointed out, with an irrefutable logic that Griphook found himself completely unable to argue with. We'll see, Griphook said. By the end of the first week, Harry had memorized the first tapestry panel and was asking about the second. 3 years passed. This was not, in the context of Gringotts, a particularly unusual length of time. Blood rights tribunals were not designed to move quickly. They were designed to move correctly, which was a different thing entirely, and the case of Harry James Potter versus the administered estate of James and Lily Potter was the most complex financial fraud case the bank had opened in 2 centuries. There were 11 distinct lines of investigation. There were 47 accounts to trace. There were authorization records to deconstruct, artifact inventories to reconstruct, and a network of holding accounts that unraveled slowly, like a badly tied knot that kept revealing more knot. Harry grew. He was 6 now, and he had grown into himself in the particular way that children do when they are fed properly and spoken to honestly, less like a plant finally getting light than like a structure finally getting the materials it was supposed to have had from the start. He was small for his age, still, but he moved through the bank's lower levels with the ease of someone who knew the place entirely, taking the narrow stair passages 3 at a time, stopping to speak to officers he'd developed opinions about, avoiding officers he'd developed other opinions about. He wore his dark hair in the same perpetual disorder that no comb had ever successfully addressed, and he had acquired, over 3 years of living underground with goblins and ledgers, a particular quality of attention, a way of watching things and people that was less like observation and more like filing. He read everything. This had started with the tapestries and expanded rapidly to encompass the bank's educational library, the historical archive, Once Griphook had negotiated access for him with the archive officer, and anything else that crossed his path. He read about goblin history and wizarding law and blood magic and the history of the major wizarding families with the same focused appetite he applied to everything, and he asked questions about all of it, constantly, the way Ragnarok had predicted, 12 questions at a time, precise and unexpected. Griphook had, at some point in the second year, stopped thinking of Harry as a case and started thinking of him as something else, which he declined to name directly because naming it would have required a kind of admission he wasn't prepared for. What he was prepared for was teaching, which he did with the thoroughness he applied to everything. Gobbledygook. Harry was already conversational, his accent nearly perfect in a way that made older goblins turn and stare. Financial history, goblin law, wizarding law, the history of the major families whose names kept appearing in the ledger. Griphook taught him chess because it seemed like the kind of thing someone should teach him, and Harry beat him for the first time at the end of 6 weeks and had been beating him consistently ever since, with a particular brand of aggressive positional play that Griphook recognized as his own style taken further than he'd ever taken it himself. Goldthorn taught him basic healing theory, because Harry kept asking about the copper compound she'd used on his back and then about everything else she did. Rekha, the archive officer, taught him script analysis and document authentication, ostensibly because the archive needed an assistant and actually because she had concluded after their third conversation that this particular child was wasted in a waiting room. Ragnarok met with him once a month and talked about things that were and were not directly related to the case, and these conversations, which Griphook was sometimes present for and sometimes not, had evolved into something that looked from the outside like mentorship and from the inside, if Ragnarok's expression was any indication, like the High Director finding someone whose 12 questions were actually worth 12 answers. Harry had never, in 3 years, asked when he could go back. He had asked, once, in the second year, whether Dumbledore knew where he was. Griphook had told him, Dumbledore had made 3 formal inquiries to the bank through the ministry in the first month after Harry's removal. Ragnarok had responded to each with the same 3-sentence letter, which stated that Gringotts was conducting a lawful inquiry under Charter 9 authority and that the subject of the inquiry was under bank protection pending the tribunal's conclusion, and that the bank would communicate its findings to the appropriate legal bodies in due course. Dumbledore had not escalated through the ministry, possibly because escalating through the ministry would have required him to explain why he was inquiring about the Potter heirs' whereabouts, and explaining that would have required him to explain the wardship documents, and the wardship documents were attached to the accounts, and the accounts were under tribunal freeze. He hasn't come himself? Harry had asked. He wouldn't get through the door, Griphook had said simply. This is our building. Harry had absorbed this with the particular expression he used when he was categorizing something, not relief, exactly, but the clean finality of a calculation completed. Then he'd gone back to the document he was analyzing for Rekha. The tribunal itself was a thing of tremendous complexity and, Griphook thought, tremendous beauty in the way a well-made trap is beautiful, elegant, inevitable, each piece fitted to the next. Ragnarok had appointed a tribunal panel of 5 senior Gringotts officers, 1 representative of the International Association of Goblin Finance, and 1 independent auditor from the continent, and they had spent 3 years doing what goblins did better than anyone else in the world, which was following money. Every transaction. Every account. Every authorization record, genuine or falsified. Every artifact transfer, traced forward from Gringotts through the external holding accounts into whatever hands had ultimately received them. The picture that emerged was, if anything, worse than the ledger alone had suggested. Griphook was present for the final tribunal summary, which Ragnarok presented to the full panel in the primary tribunal chamber, a circular room on the 3rd level, walls lined with the bank's golden seals of charter authority, with Harry sitting beside him and the ledger, now annotated to within an inch of its life, open on the table in front of them. The summary ran to 93 pages. The short version went like this. Beginning in November 1981, Albus Dumbledore had used his position as self-appointed guardian of Harry Potter to access the Potter accounts through a series of instruments that were technically legal, barely, and only because the relevant charter provisions had not been tested in 2 centuries and their loopholes had not been closed. He had removed artifacts, resigned seats, voided contracts, and transferred gold through a network of holding accounts that were, when fully traced, registered to a range of entities and individuals with varying degrees of legitimacy and darkness. Some transfers appeared to have funded genuine causes, scholarships, institutional maintenance, research programs. Others were harder to explain, including the Lestrange transaction and 3 others that the tribunal had flagged as probable dark application pending further investigation. The cloak had been recovered. It was in a transit vault at a bank office in Edinburgh, where it had apparently sat unexamined for 2 years because the account it had been transferred to was nominally dormant. The tribunal had seized it under Blood Rights Recovery Authority. The Wiesengemot seats were complicated. Resignations in the Wiesengemot were, under normal circumstances, irrevocable. However, resignations made on behalf of a minor without blood authorization were, under Goblin charter law, void from inception. They had never been legally valid. This was an argument that would need to be made in a court, not a bank, but the bank could support it with documentation, and the documentation was comprehensive. The alliance contracts were similar. Voiding a contract required the agreement of both parties. The Black family, whose alliance contract with the Potters had been unilaterally declared null by Dumbledore, had not been consulted. The contract was, in the tribunal's finding, still in effect. The blood authorization records, the falsified ones, were the criminal heart of it. Gringotts did not have criminal jurisdiction over wizards. But it had the authority to certify evidence for submission to a legal body that did, and the tribunal's documentation of the falsified records was a thing of such meticulous, unimpeachable thoroughness that Griphook, reading it, felt the deep professional satisfaction of a job done exactly right. Harry sat through the full summary without fidgeting, which would have been remarkable in any 6-year-old and was in Harry's case simply characteristic. He had been given a copy of the summary beforehand and had read it twice. Griphook knew this because Harry had appeared in his office at 6 in the morning with 3 pages of notes and the careful, focused expression he wore when something had made him genuinely angry and he was deciding what to do with it. The Lestrange thing, Harry had said, putting his notes on Griphook's desk. Page 47. Binding protection voiding instrument. What does that mean exactly? What does it do? Griphook had looked at the notes, and at Harry, and had told him the truth. A binding protection voiding instrument was a dark artifact that, when properly activated, could strip magical protections from a specific bloodline, remove the inherited enchantments and wards that a family accumulated over generations. What made it dark was the method of activation, which required, he paused here, and Harry's eyes had gone very still, required a blood price. It means, Harry had said, with the quiet precision of someone stating a conclusion rather than asking a question, that he sold something that could have been used to hurt me to people who were already trying to hurt me. That's one reading, Griphook had said carefully. What's another one? Griphook hadn't answered immediately, because the honest answer was that he didn't have one. Harry had nodded once, picked up his notes, and left. He had not raised his voice. He had not cried. He had gone to his room, and an hour later Griphook had passed the door and heard the particular sound of someone doing something with intense physical focus. Harry had a practice space that one of the officers had cleared for him, where he worked through the early physical exercises that Goblin combat training used as a foundation. Because he'd asked Griphook about the bank's security force and Griphook had made the executive decision that a child with his particular set of enemies should know how to move. The sound from the practice room was fast and exact and had the quality of controlled fury being put to productive use, and Griphook had walked past without stopping because some things were private and some things were none of his business, and some things were both. Now, in the tribunal chamber, with the summary complete, Ragnarok looked around the table at his panel and said, "Findings." 7 voices, one by one, sustained. Ragnarok turned to Harry. The tribunal finds in favor of the blood rights heir. The Potter estate, in full, is yours. The falsified records are certified for external submission. The cloak is returned to your vault. A formal demand for the return of all transferred assets will be issued to the relevant accounts and individuals within the week. He paused. There is the matter of what comes next. The Wiesengemot, Harry said. Yes. We need someone to take it there. Ragnar's eyes moved briefly to Griphook. We have someone in mind. The someone in mind was Augusta Longbottom, a fact that Griphook delivered to Harry that evening with the kind of summary efficiency he applied to briefings. Augusta Longbottom, née Croaker, was the matriarch of an old wizarding family, a decorated former Auror, a sitting Wizengamot member, and one of the handful of people in British wizarding society who was capable of looking Dumbledore in the face and saying something he didn't want to hear without subsequently developing a concern for her own well-being. She was also, more usefully, furious. Ragnar had reached out to her through a mutual contact in the Goblin Liaison Office, provided enough of the summary to warrant her attention, and received back a response that Griphook described as concise and unambiguous. What did it say? Harry asked. Griphook produced the letter. It was 6 words, send me everything. I'll be there. Harry read it twice, and for the first time in the 3 years Griphook had known him, he grinned, not the careful, contained almost smiles he produced occasionally, but a full, unguarded grin that made him look, briefly, entirely his age. I like her already, he said. Augusta Longbottom arrived 2 days later. She was a tall woman of late middle age, with steel-gray hair pinned in an architectural arrangement and the upright bearing of someone who had decided as a young person to take up room in the world and had been doing so ever since. She wore deep green robes and carried a handbag that seemed to contain half the documentation she'd already gathered independently, and she walked into Ragnar's office with the easy authority of someone who visited the High Director of Gringotts regularly enough not to be impressed by the granite desk. She sat down, looked across the table at Harry, and said, "You're James and Lily's boy." "Yes," said Harry. "You have your mother's eyes and your father's hair and, from what I've read, considerably more sense than either of them had at 6. She opened her handbag and produced a roll of parchment. "I've done some independent verification. The Wizengamot seat resignations are invalid, my own legal team confirmed it this morning. The question is procedure. Challenging a resignation, even an invalid one, requires a formal petition, which requires a petitioner with standing, which requires me," said Harry. Augusta looked at him. "You're 6. The charter doesn't specify an age requirement for a blood rights petitioner," Harry said. Griphook checked. A pause. Augusta looked at Griphook with an expression of moderate surprise. Griphook looked back with the neutral expression he reserved for situations he was quietly pleased about. "He checked," Augusta repeated. "He's thorough," Griphook said. Augusta turned back to Harry, and her expression underwent a recalibration that Griphook recognized because it was similar to what Ragnar's face had done 4 years ago in this same office, the upward revision, the assessment updating. "All right," she said. Charter 9, Article 4, Subparagraph 7. You have standing. But filing a petition means going before the full Wizengamot, and the full Wizengamot includes people who will not appreciate having Dumbledore's management of your estate challenged publicly." "I know," Harry said. Griphook explained who's on the Wizengamot. "And most of them will follow whoever seems to have the most power. Right now that's Dumbledore. But if the ledger's certified and the evidence is in front of them," Harry stopped, put his hands flat on the table the way he'd seen Ragnar do when making a point, "power shifts." Augusta looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Ragnar. Then at Griphook. Then back at Harry, and this time the expression was not just revised but decided, with the quality of a general who has found the ground she wants to hold. "How long to prepare the petition?" she asked. "A month," Griphook said. "Possibly 6 weeks. I need 8. I have allies to speak to," quietly. She paused. "Some of them will be uncomfortable. Some will pretend the evidence doesn't mean what it means. A few will surprise you." She met Harry's eyes. "Are you prepared for this to be very public and very ugly?" "It's already ugly," Harry said. "I'd rather it be public." Augusta nodded once, sharply, with the efficiency of someone checking an item off a list. She pulled out 3 more rolls of parchment from the seemingly inexhaustible handbag and laid them on the desk. Then here's what I need from the bank's side. They worked for 4 hours. Harry kept up with all of it. This was not unremarkable. Augusta's legal team had been working on wizarding property and inheritance law for weeks, and the documents she produced were dense with precedent and historical reference. Harry read everything that came across the table, asked questions that were occasionally so specific they made Augusta look up sharply, and at one point corrected a citation in Augusta's parchment that had referenced the wrong year of the relevant charter amendment. Augusta had looked at the correction, confirmed it, and then looked at Harry with an expression that was somewhere between approval and something older, something that had grief in it, the way approval sometimes does when the person you're approving of is someone who should have had their parents there to see it. Your mother would have enjoyed you enormously, she said, quietly. Harry met her eyes. Griphook told me she was brilliant. She was. A pause. She was also entirely unwilling to let anything pass that seemed wrong to her. I saw her stand up in the Wisengamot. She wasn't a member, she was testifying in a hearing, and correct 3 senior members on a point of magical law, politely, completely, and with a precision that left no room for argument. Augusta rolled a parchment. It did not make her universally popular. I'm not trying to be popular, Harry said. Augusta looked at him, and this time the expression was simple and clear. No, she said. You're trying to be right. That's considerably more useful. She began gathering her parchments. I'll have my team file the preliminary petition within a week. Gringotts provides the certified evidence package. We do not leak anything to the press beforehand. I know someone at the Prophet who will come to me when the filing goes public, and I want the story to run on our terms. What about Dumbledore? Harry asked. He'll know within days of the filing. He has friends in the clerk's office. Augusta stood, smoothing her robes. He'll try to address it before it becomes a hearing. He'll want to resolve it quietly. And we won't let him, Harry said. No, said Augusta Longbottom. We will not. She left, and the room was quieter after her, in the way that rooms are quiet after something purposeful has moved through them. Ragnarok remained at his desk with the expression of a man who is internally reviewing a game he thought he understood and discovering new levels to it. Griphook stood by the window into the atrium, watching the phosphorescent plants below, thinking through timelines. Harry sat at the table for a moment longer, then pushed his chair back and stood up. He looked, Griphook thought, the same way he had looked at 3 years old when he decided to trust him in the doorway of the cupboard, fully committed to the direction of travel, no hesitation, the decision already made and the question now being only what came next. I need to learn more about the Wisengamot, Harry said. Who's on it, how they vote, who they're afraid of, who they owe favors to. That's an extensive research project, Griphook said. Good, said Harry. I work better when I have a lot to do. Griphook looked at him. This was accurate. He had spent 3 years with the boy and had never once seen him bored, never seen him passive, never seen him sit in a situation and wait for it to resolve itself. He moved through problems the way water moves through stone, not forcefully, not spectacularly, but persistently and precisely, finding the grain of the thing and working along it until it gave. The archive has full membership records going back 50 years, Griphook said. Voting histories. Financial disclosures. Cross-reference that with the holding accounts in the tribunal summary and you'll have a clear picture of who has what kind of relationship with Dumbledore. And the ones who don't, Harry said. I want to know who's afraid of him but isn't loyal to him. Those are different things. Griphook paused. Yes, he said. They are. Someone afraid of him is someone we can reach, once they see the evidence. Harry moved to the door, already in motion, already thinking ahead. Someone loyal to him is someone who'll need to be convinced separately. Or not at all. Not all of them will be convincible, Griphook warned. Not all of them have to be, Harry said. We just need enough. He stopped in the doorway and looked back, and for a moment the lamplight caught his face at an angle that was, briefly and completely, his mother's precision in his father's frame. How many seats does a majority take? Griphook told him. Harry nodded, calculating. Then we need to start there, he said, and walked out into the corridor with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where they're going and is already most of the way there. The next 8 weeks were, in Griphook's professional estimation, some of the most productively exhausting of his career. Harry did what he said he was going to do, which was never surprising but was consistently impressive. He worked through the Wisingamot archive records with the systematic thoroughness of a trained auditor, producing a document that mapped every sitting member's voting history, known financial relationships, family alliances, and connection to Dumbledore across 3 categories: loyal, compliant, and independent. He color-coded it, which Griphook had not expected, and the result was a visual diagram that Griphook took a photograph of and added to his own case file because it was, in his considered opinion, more analytically coherent than half the briefing materials his senior colleagues produced. Augusta worked her contacts. She came back twice with additional names for the independent column and once with a name that surprised even Ragnarok, a senior Wisingamot member who had apparently been waiting for exactly this kind of formally documented challenge for over a year and whose willingness to speak in the chamber would carry significant weight. The certified evidence package from the tribunal was compiled, bound, and sealed with the bank's highest-level verification seal. 93 pages of findings, 412 pages of supporting documentation, all of it arranged so that the narrative was clear even to someone who didn't want it to be. Griphook had reviewed it 7 times and still felt the same cold, exact satisfaction every time he reached page 47. On the 40th day, Augusta filed the petition. That evening, Griphook found Harry in the atrium garden on the 7th level, sitting cross-legged on the stone bench by the largest of the phosphorescent plant arrangements, reading a document that turned out, when Griphook looked over his shoulder, to be the full text of Charter 9. "It's filed," Griphook said. Harry looked up. The plant light caught the green of his eyes and made them something extraordinary. When will he know? By tomorrow morning, if Augusta's right about the clerk's office. A pause. And then? And then he'll try to manage it, Griphook said, sitting on the bench beside him. He's very good at managing things. He'll frame it as a misunderstanding, a procedural complexity, something he was about to address anyway. He'll make himself sound reasonable and concerned and put upon, and several people who aren't looking at the evidence will find that convincing. But we have the evidence, Harry said. Yes. Which is why we keep the conversation on the evidence. Every time it drifts to personalities or politics, we bring it back to the ledger. Back to the dates. Back to the Lestrange transaction. Griphook paused. He'll try to make this about who you are. A child. A ward. Someone who doesn't understand the complexity of adult decisions made in difficult circumstances. Harry looked at him steadily. What do I do with that? You let him finish, Griphook said, and then you put the document in front of him. And you watch him look at it. And you don't say anything. Harry thought about this, turning the charter page without reading it. He's going to try to talk to me directly, he said. At some point. Before the hearing. Griphook had been thinking the same thing. Probably. Should I? That's your choice, Griphook said, and meant it. He'll try to be disarming. He'll have explanations. He's very intelligent and he believes, I think, most of what he'll tell you. That makes it worse, Harry said quietly. Yes. The atrium was still, the plants cycling slowly through their light patterns, the deep hum of the vault systems just audible through the stone. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way they had learned to sit together over 3 years, Griphook never filling silence for its own sake, Harry never needing it filled. I've been thinking about the cloak, Harry said eventually. It's in your vault. I know. But it was flagged as restricted, sovereign in the original ledger. What does that mean exactly? Griphook looked at him. Where did you read about that? Page 6. I've had the tribunal summary for 2 months. Griphook sighed. It means it is a sovereign artifact, something that belongs to a specific bloodline by ancient right, not by purchase or inheritance in the conventional sense. It cannot be sold, only passed. It cannot be used by anyone outside the bloodline without degradation of its properties. He paused. The Potter family has had it for a very long time. Longer than most things in the vault. What is it exactly? Harry asked, and his voice was curious in the way it always was when he'd already formed a theory and was testing whether Griphook would confirm it. It is what it sounds like, Griphook said. A cloak of invisibility. A genuine one, not an enchanted garment, but an object of deeper making. You're old enough to understand that distinction. There are stories about objects like that, Harry said. He'd been in the archive for 3 years. Very old stories. Griphook looked at him for a moment, then looked at the plants. There are, he said. We can discuss those another time. Griphook. Another time, Harry. Harry closed the charter. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something Griphook had not expected, in a tone he hadn't heard before from him, not analytical, not strategic, but something younger and more direct. Are you worried about the hearing? Griphook considered this with the honesty he had always applied to Harry's questions. I'm concerned that powerful men with complicated records have a way of surviving scrutiny that they shouldn't, he said. I'm concerned that the Wisengamot will look at this evidence and find reasons to be uncertain that have nothing to do with the evidence itself. I'm concerned that what should be simple, the ledger says what it says, will be made complicated by people with reasons to keep it complicated. A pause. And I'm not going to let any of that happen, Griphook said, simply and completely. Whatever it takes. Harry looked at him with those green eyes, and there was something in the look that was nothing like 3 years old and nothing like 6, something that had been built slowly and carefully and deliberately over years of cupboards and corridors and lessons and ledgers and one very bad night and one extraordinary morning, and Griphook sat with it without looking away. Okay, Harry said, the same word he'd said in the cupboard doorway at the very beginning. The same tone. The same finality. Okay. We're doing this. Griphook looked at the plants for a moment longer, then stood. Get some sleep, he said. The hearing is in 6 weeks, and you still have 40 pages of Wisengamot membership records to cross-reference. Harry was already opening the charter again. I'll sleep when the cross-referencing is done. You'll sleep at a reasonable hour, Griphook said, or Goldthorn will hear about it. The threat of Goldthorn's particular brand of medical authority was, Griphook had discovered, reliably effective. Harry made a face, tucked the charter under his arm, and stood. They walked back toward the residential level together through the blue-lit corridors, the vault hummed steady beneath the stone, the bank around them vast and old and entirely theirs, and in the evidence vaults the certified package sat sealed and complete and waiting, and somewhere above them in the wizarding world a petition had been filed and a very powerful man was going to read it in the morning. And the morning after that everything was going to change. Chapter 3, The Wisengamot Burns. The Ministry of Magic was designed to intimidate. This was not accidental. The atrium alone, black floors, golden fireplaces, the enormous winged statue at its center, had been built in an era when the Ministry wanted Wizarding Britain to walk through its doors and feel small. It worked on most people. The ceiling went up further than it needed to, the corridors were slightly wider than comfortable, the lifts announced their floors in a voice that managed to sound both cheerful and bureaucratically absolute. The effect was cumulative. By the time you reached the upper levels, you had been reminded, architecturally and systematically, that you were here by permission. Harry walked through the atrium at 10 years old and looked at everything with the bright, cataloguing attention he brought to new places, and Griphook, walking beside him, watched him take it all in without a trace of being impressed. The 4 years between the tribunal and today had done what years do when they're properly used. Harry was not tall, he suspected he'd inherited his father's eventual height but was currently working through what appeared to be a deliberate delay, but he carried himself with the easy assurance of someone comfortable in their own body, the product of 6 years of the movement exercises that Gringotts' security chief had eventually formalized into actual training sessions after watching Harry teach himself with characteristic independence. He was lean and quick and had a stillness to him when he wasn't moving that goblins recognized as something particular, the stillness of someone who is always paying attention. He was wearing robes today, proper wizarding robes, deep blue. Griphook had insisted on the image, and Harry had not argued because Harry understood image, and he carried himself in them without stiffness or self-consciousness, as though they were simply what he was wearing today, and the question of what anyone thought about that was not one he'd allocated time to consider. Augusta was waiting at the lift. She looked exactly as she had 4 years ago, except that the parchment roll she carried had been replaced by a leather briefcase, which suggested she'd acquired more documentation since the filing. She looked Harry over once, nodded with the efficient approval of someone confirming that a plan was executing correctly, and pressed the lift button. "Chambers are on level 9, she said. "We have 90 minutes before the session opens. I've arranged a private room to review the order of presentation." She looked at Griphook. "The evidence package?" "Delivered to the chambers clerk at 9 this morning," Griphook said. "Certified copies distributed to all sitting members per the petitioner's right. Every member has had it since yesterday afternoon." Augusta's mouth tightened slightly. "And Dumbledore?" "Was on the distribution list." The lift arrived. They stepped in, and it descended. Harry had been quiet since they'd arrived, which was not unusual. He went quiet when he was thinking, which was most of the time, and when he was in new environments he tended to observe before he spoke. But as the lift went down through the levels he said, without preamble, "He's here already." Griphook looked at him. "What makes you think that?" "Someone on the atrium floor recognized me," Harry said. "They turned away too quickly when I looked at them. And there was a man near the Golden Gates who was trying not to watch us but kept watching. Neither of them was ministry staff." A pause. "Dumbledore will want to know we've arrived. He'll want time to set the frame before the session opens." Augusta made a sound that in a less composed woman would have been a snort. "He's been setting the frame for a week. I've had 3 owls from Wisengamot members asking me to consider a private resolution. All 3 worded almost identically." She opened her briefcase and produced the letters. "He didn't write them himself, of course. He never does." Harry took the letters, read them in approximately 30 seconds each, and handed them back. "Which members?" Augusta told him. Harry nodded. Griphook recognized the look, cross-referencing against the color-coded diagram, and said, "The first one's afraid of him but not loyal. He'll follow the room." He paused. "The second one owes him a favor, but it's a social favor, not a legal one. He'll need to see the evidence clearly laid out before he can justify breaking with him. The third one, a beat, the third one's on the Lestrange holding account." Augusta's hand stilled on the briefcase. "I beg your pardon." "Page 71 of the certified package," Harry said. "Sub-account art 7-3. The Lestrange holding account had a secondary registered operator. The name is partial, the tribunal couldn't fully trace it, but the registration date and the identifier code matched the financial disclosure that third member filed with the Wisengamot 3 years ago." He met Augusta's eyes. "He's not afraid of Dumbledore. He's invested in the same outcome." The lift opened onto level 9, and Augusta stood still for exactly 2 seconds, the measure of a woman being genuinely surprised and giving it exactly as much time as it deserved. Then she stepped out of the lift and said, "I'll need to revise the opening statement." "I already did," Harry said, and produced a folded sheet of parchment from inside his robes. Augusta took it, unfolded it, read the first paragraph. Her expression moved through several things and arrived at something that was somewhere between exasperation and profound satisfaction. "How long have you known about the sub-account?" 3 weeks. I wanted to verify before I said anything." "You verified independently?" "Rekka helped," Harry said. "Archive cross-referencing." Augusta looked at Griphook, who was walking slightly behind and to the right and who met her gaze with the expression of a man who had been dealing with this for 6 years and had long since moved past surprise. You've been letting a 10-year-old conduct independent financial investigations, Augusta said. I've been letting a 10-year-old do what he's good at, Griphook said. They're not actually different things. The private room was small and wood-paneled, with a table and 6 chairs and a door that locked from the inside. Augusta spread her revised materials on the table and they worked through the order of presentation with the focused efficiency that had characterized every meeting the three of them had held, Harry precise and prepared, Augusta structurally sharp, Griphook filling the technical gaps in goblin law that neither of them could cover from their own expertise. At one point Harry looked up from the revised statement and said, "He's going to try the greater good argument." "Of course he is," Augusta said. "So we need to make sure we establish the Lestrange transaction before he can make the case that everything was done for positive purposes. Once that's in front of the room, the greater good argument collapses, because there's no version of greater good that involves selling dark instruments targeted at a child's bloodline." "Agreed," said Augusta. "We lead with the Lestrange evidence." "And the cloak transfer," Harry added. "Because it was explicitly flagged in the family's own records as non-transferable." "That's not a legal technicality, that's a direct contravention of an explicit documented instruction. It's the simplest item in the package and it's completely unambiguous." Griphook put his copy of the package on the table, turned to the flagged pages, and placed them at the front of his stack. Augusta did the same with her version. Harry looked at the arrangement for a moment, then pushed his own copy to the side and put his hands flat on the table. "I want to say something today," he said. It was stated simply, as a fact, but there was a quality to it that made both Griphook and Augusta look at him directly. "The petition speaks for you," Augusta said carefully. "Legally, you don't need to." "I know I don't need to," Harry said. "I want to." Augusta looked at him. Griphook looked at him. Harry looked back at both of them with the steady green gaze that had made Ragnarok revise his expectations upward 7 years ago and had been making people do the same thing ever since. "All right," Augusta said. "When?" "At the end. After the evidence, after the arguments, after everything else has been said." He paused. "I want to be the last thing they see before they vote." Griphook thought about the Wisengamot chamber, the tiered stone seating, the space at the center floor, the weight of old authority that pressed down from the walls. He thought about the sitting members who would be looking for reasons to be uncertain, and the ones who were afraid, and the one who was invested in the outcome for worse reasons than any of them, and he thought about what it would mean for this particular 10-year-old to stand in that center space and say what he had to say. "Fine," he said. "But I speak first." Harry nodded. "You should. You found it." The Wisengamot chamber was everything the ministry's architecture had been working up to, a circular room that went up 5 levels, every tier packed with sitting members in plum robes, the stone walls hung with the symbols of wizarding Britain's legal history going back to the medieval period. The gallery above the public viewing level was standing room only. Harry had expected an audience. Augusta had told him the filing had generated significant interest, but the sheer density of people in the room was something different, a weight of attention that was almost physical. He felt it and filed it and moved on. Griphook walked beside him to the petitioner's position on the chamber floor, and Augusta took her place at the advocate's stand, and they were arranged and ready before the chief warlock called the session to order, and Harry used those few minutes to look around the room and find faces. He found the first letter writer in the 3rd tier, looking studiously at his copy of the evidence package. He found the second in the 4th tier, visibly uncomfortable in the way people are when they've decided to be uncomfortable in advance. He found the third, the sub-account registrant, in the 2nd tier, and that one was watching Harry with an expression that was too controlled, too still, the expression of someone who has decided exactly how they're going to look and is maintaining it with effort. He found Dumbledore in the highest tier. He was exactly what Griphook had described over the years, tall, silver-bearded, robed in deep purple that managed to be both stately and approachable, with half-moon spectacles and eyes that were, even at this distance, undeniably kind. He looked like wisdom. He looked like safety. He looked like the kind of man who gave complicated things simple names and made you feel that the simplicity was a gift. He was looking at Harry. Harry looked back, steady and unhurried, and did not look away first. Dumbledore's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a shift, an adjustment, the recognition of something he hadn't quite accounted for, and Harry held his gaze until the Chief Warlock's gavel came down and the session opened, and then he turned back to the front, because he had seen what he needed to see. Griphook spoke first, as agreed. He was extraordinary at it. Griphook before a formal body was nothing like Griphook in a corridor or at a desk. He was precise and unhurried and stripped everything down to its essential structure, presenting the evidence with the quality of someone showing you a mathematical proof, each step following from the last with a logic so clean that challenging any part of it meant challenging the foundation of how numbers worked. He covered the falsified blood authorizations in 11 minutes and the silence in the room deepened with each page reference. He covered the artifact transfers in 8 minutes and Augusta watched the second-tier member's face during the cloak section and saw exactly what Harry had predicted. The Lestrange transaction he covered last, and he took his time with it. Page 47, he said, with the particular quiet of a voice that knows it doesn't need volume to fill a room. The transaction dated March 1983. The asset transferred is described in the bank's own records as a binding protection voiding instrument, dark application, Potter bloodline, primary. The receiving account is registered to House Lestrange. The authorization signature is Albus Dumbledore's. The blood confirmation is dated 4 days after the transaction. He looked up from the page, directly at the tiered seating. 4 days. After the transaction it was supposed to authorize before it occurred. The room was very quiet. I want to be precise about what this means in goblin law, Griphook continued, because precision matters. A blood confirmation filed after a transaction is not a blood confirmation. It is a document describing a blood confirmation that did not happen. It is, under Charter 9, Section 41, Paragraph 3, falsification of a sovereign financial instrument. And the instrument that was authorized by this falsification was a dark artifact targeted at the bloodline of a 3-year-old child and delivered to a family who, at the time of this transaction, were awaiting trial at the Ministry of Magic for crimes including the torture of 2 Aurors. He closed the evidence package. The bank asks no conclusions of this body. We present facts. The facts are in your hands. He stepped back. Augusta stood. She presented the legal argument for the invalidity of the Wisengamot seat resignations in 14 minutes, with 4 historical precedents and 3 charter references, and she presented it with the quality of someone who has been waiting years to say this in exactly this room and intends to say all of it. The gallery above was leaning forward. The sitting members in the lower tiers were looking at each other. The upper tiers were very still. Then Augusta said, "The petitioner wishes to address the chamber." The Chief Warlock looked at Harry. "The petitioner may approach." Harry walked to the center of the chamber floor. It was a large space, designed to make the person standing in it feel alone. Harry stood in it and felt nothing of the kind. He had been alone in a cupboard, and this was the opposite of that, and he knew the difference. He looked up at the tiers, at the 500 and more faces looking back at him, and then he looked at Dumbledore, and then he began to speak. "My name is Harry James Potter," he said, and his voice was calm and carried well, the benefit of 6 years of corridors and chambers. "My parents were James and Lily Potter. They died when I was 1 year old. I didn't know them. I have never known them, because I was placed in a house where the only thing said about them was that they were freaks, and the only thing I learned about magic in my first 3 years of life was that I wasn't supposed to do it, and the cupboard they locked me in had 2 bolts on the outside." The chamber was absolutely still. "I'm not saying this for sympathy," Harry said. "I'm saying it because the person who placed me in that house is the same person whose signature is on every falsified document in your hands, and I want the room to be clear about the complete picture. Not the piece of it that involves financial records, which is compelling on its own. The complete picture." He paused, letting that sit. "Albus Dumbledore had legal authority over my life from the moment my parents died. He used that authority to remove my family's assets from accounts that were mine by blood right, to void protections my family had built over generations, to sell a dark instrument targeted at me to people who wanted to hurt me, and then to place me with people who hurt me in a smaller and more consistent way for 3 years. Another pause. I'm 10 years old. I have read every page of that evidence package. I have spent 4 years helping prepare it. And I want to say clearly, to this room, that what happened to my family's estate was not a misunderstanding, and it was not complicated, and it was not done for a greater good that I'm too young to understand. He looked directly at Dumbledore. I am not too young to read a ledger. I am not too young to read a date and understand what it means when a blood authorization is filed 4 days after the transaction it was supposed to authorize. I am not too young to understand that my family had protections that were stripped and a cloak that was taken and allies that were cut off and political influence that was quietly redistributed, all within 3 years of my parents' deaths, all while I was in a cupboard. He looked away from Dumbledore, back to the room. The Wisengamot deals in law. So do I. The law says those seats are mine. The law says those assets were never legally transferred. The evidence says exactly what it says, and I've stood here and told you what it means, and now I'll sit down. He walked back to his position. The chamber was still for 3 seconds, and then it wasn't. The noise that broke out was not the orderly procedural discussion of a formal body. It was the noise of 500 people deciding simultaneously to talk to the person next to them, and it filled the room with a layered, complex sound that took the chief warlock 2 gavel strikes to reduce to something workable. Then Dumbledore stood. He did it without hurry, with the ease of someone who had stood in rooms like this many times and knew exactly what his standing meant to the people in them. He adjusted his robes, and he looked at the chief warlock, and he waited for permission to speak with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is its own form of authority. Chief Warlock, he said, when the nod came, I appreciate the seriousness with which this body takes financial oversight, and I appreciate the considerable care that has been taken in the preparation of these materials. His voice was warm and thoughtful and careful in the way that Griphook had described to Harry years ago, disarming by design. I would ask only that we take a moment to consider context. He paused. He looked at Harry with an expression of, and this was, Griphook thought, masterfully done, gentle sadness, as though he were watching a child make a painful mistake. Harry has grown up away from our world, through no fault of his own, and has been presented with a document that is detailed and extensive and which, as a result, naturally appears to tell a complete story. I would submit that it does not. He spread his hands. The measures taken with the Potter estate in the years following the Potters' deaths were not unauthorized. They were taken under emergency wartime instruments that this body authorized in 1979 and which remained in effect through 1984, instruments that granted senior ministry liaisons flexibility in the management of estates belonging to casualties of the conflict, in order to protect assets from seizure by remaining dark forces. He looked around the room. I have the relevant authorizations. I would like to submit them for the Chamber's consideration. An assistant brought forward a roll of parchment. The chief warlock accepted it. Harry looked at Griphook. Griphook's expression hadn't changed, but his eyes had gone to a quality that Harry recognized, the focused stillness of someone who has seen this exact play before. Griphook, Harry said, very quietly. The 1979, emergency wartime estate instruments were repealed in full in February 1982, Griphook said, at exactly the volume required to be heard only by Harry and Augusta. Every transaction he's about to claim was authorized by them occurred after their repeal. I have the repeal documentation in the package. Appendix C. Appendix C, Harry said to Augusta. Augusta was already turning to it. Dumbledore continued speaking, warm and measured, building the frame that Griphook had predicted. Difficult times, necessary measures, a commitment to Harry's eventual inheritance of his full estate at majority, a relationship with ministry oversight that had been fully documented. He said this with the confidence of a man who believes the documentation is what he thinks it is, and a deep, genuine concern for the young man's well-being that had always been his primary motivation. He was very good at it. Griphook could feel the room moving, the uncertain members finding the easier path, the relief of having a simpler narrative available. Then Augusta stood and said, "Chief Warlock, I'd like to direct the chamber's attention to Appendix C of the evidence package." The room shifted back. Augusta laid it out with the same clean efficiency Griphook had used, the emergency wartime estate instruments, their text, their repeal date, February 14, 1982, and the list of every transaction Dumbledore had just claimed they authorized, with the dates those transactions had occurred. The earliest was March 1982. The latest was mid-1983. Every single one of them post-dated the repeal by weeks or months or over a year. The instruments he has cited, Augusta said, did not exist at the time of any transaction in the evidence package. Not one. The chamber is welcome to verify the repeal date, it is public record, it is in the Gringotts' own archive, it was filed in this building. I am happy to wait. The silence that followed was a different quality from the one after Griphook had spoken. That had been the silence of absorbing information. This was the silence of a room that had almost been misled and knew it. The second letter writer in the fourth tier put down his evidence package and looked at his hands. The first letter writer in the third tier was looking at the Appendix C page with an expression like a man watching a bridge he thought was solid turn out to be made of paper. The sub-account registrant in the second tier had gone very still. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. And in that moment, just the gap between one sentence and the next, Griphook watched something happen behind the warm and wise and disarming face. Not panic. Nothing as unstable as that. Something more controlled, recalibration. The shift of a very intelligent person adapting their strategy in real time. The repeal date is, of course, a matter of record, Dumbledore said, smoothly, without a pause long enough to read as hesitation if you weren't looking for it. The instruments I cited were the basis of the original arrangements, which then continued, improperly, I acknowledge, by strict date, out of inertia and the press of other matters during a chaotic period. I take full responsibility for not ensuring the proper reauthorization of those arrangements in a timely manner. He was admitting fault. Minor fault. The kind you admit to prevent someone from proving the larger fault. That, Griphook said, quietly, to Harry, is the concession. Harry stood up. The chief warlock looked at him, slightly surprised. The petitioner has already addressed the chamber, the petitioner has the right to respond to new testimony, Augusta said immediately, because Harry had told her 3 weeks ago that Dumbledore might try the limited concession move, and they had verified that the petitioner's right of response covered new testimony made after the initial presentation. She cited the relevant procedural rule. The chief warlock consulted a clerk. The clerk confirmed. Harry walked back to the center of the floor. The gentleman, Harry said, with a courtesy so precise it had an edge to it, has just acknowledged that transactions affecting my family's estate were conducted without proper legal authorization. He's characterized this as inertia and chaos. He looked up at Dumbledore's tier. I'd like to address the Lestrange transaction specifically, since the inertia and chaos argument requires us to believe that a dark artifact targeted at my bloodline was sold to a family awaiting trial for torture because things were busy and the paperwork slipped. He let that sit. I'd also like to address the cloak, because the Potter family's own records, which are in the evidence package, page 6, explicitly flagged that item as not to be transferred under any circumstances. Not as a recommendation. As an instruction. The instruction was not followed. He paused. Inertia doesn't explain a decision made against an explicit written instruction. Chaos doesn't explain a blood authorization filed 4 days after a transaction. These are choices. They look like choices when you look at them carefully, and I have looked at them very carefully, and I'd ask the chamber to do the same. He sat down. The chief warlock called for a 20-minute recess. The room erupted the moment the gavel fell. In the corridor outside, in the stretch of ministry hallway that Augusta had commandeered as an informal briefing space, Harry stood with his back against the stone wall and felt the particular quiet that comes after speaking in front of a large crowd, the room still vibrating in the bones somewhere, the attention of 500 people still present as a physical memory. That was well done, Griphook said. The inertia argument would have worked on some of them, Harry said. It nearly did, Griphook agreed. The Appendix C moment was better than anything I could have planned, because it let the room feel what it feels like to almost be fooled by him. That's harder to come back from than just being shown evidence. Augusta reappeared from a side door with the expression of someone who has just had 3 conversations in 3 minutes and all of them were useful. The 4th-tier member is off the list, she said. He's asked me privately if the evidence package includes the Black Family Alliance contract documentation, and it does, and he wants to discuss it. She paused. The 2nd-tier member, the sub-account, has left the chamber. Harry looked at her. Left? Stood up and walked out during the recess. His assistant told the clerk he had a prior commitment. Augusta's mouth was doing the thing it did when she was doing the work of not showing a particular expression. His vote won't be cast today. He knew we'd identified the account, Harry said. Almost certainly. The question is whether he comes back and votes against you to protect himself, or stays away. Augusta closed her briefcase. My assessment is he stays away. Coming back calls attention to his departure, and attention is the last thing he wants today. Harry nodded, calculating. What's our count without him? Augusta produced a folded piece of paper that was a copy of Harry's color-coded diagram, updated in her own handwriting. She showed him the numbers. Harry looked at them for a moment. It's close, he said. It's close, Augusta confirmed. But Dumbledore's concession hurt him in the room more than he knows. Several people who were leaning his direction because he seemed certain are now uncertain, and uncertain people, when forced to vote in public on a matter of clear legal record, vote the record, Harry finished. Usually. Griphook was watching the corridor, watching the ministry staff moving past, watching the members returning from recess, reading faces the way Harry had taught himself to do from a very young age, though Griphook would have said it the other way around. He saw 2 things in the space of 30 seconds, a member he recognized from the independent column stop and speak to a member from the loyal column, and the body language of the conversation told him everything, and he turned back. There's movement, he said. Enough? Harry asked. Enough for today, I think. Griphook paused. He'll challenge the result if it's close. He has procedural avenues. Let him, Harry said. Every challenge extends the case on public record. Every extension is another week of the evidence package sitting in front of people. He pushed off the wall, straightening his robes. We want this to run long if it runs. The longer it runs, the more people read page 47. Griphook looked at him, this 10-year-old in deep blue robes who had just addressed the Wisingamot like he'd been doing it for decades, who had spent 4 years preparing for this morning, who had identified a sub-account connection that the bank's professional investigators had flagged but not fully processed, who had predicted the concession move and prepared a response for it 3 weeks in advance. Your mother, Griphook said, would have had 17 questions by now. Harry's mouth curved. I have 17 questions. I'm saving them for after the vote. The session reconvened. Dumbledore spoke once more, shorter this time, careful, the frame significantly narrowed from his opening, and 3 of his known supporters spoke after him, their statements notably less certain than they would have been that morning, the kind of uncertainty that happens when the ground has shifted and nobody's told you by how much. Then the chief warlock called the vote on the primary petition, the invalidity of the Wisingamot seat resignations and the return of the Potter estate to the Bloodrights heir. It was not a landslide. It was better than a landslide. It was the kind of margin that was too large to challenge on procedural grounds and too clearly documented to attribute to anything other than what the evidence showed, and when the chief warlock read the count Harry sat completely still for a moment and then looked at Griphook, and Griphook, who had not smiled in a professional context in approximately 8 years, did something with the corner of his mouth that constituted, by his personal standards, a significant and genuine expression of satisfaction. The seats are restored, Augusta said, in the corridor after, where they had retreated while the chamber dissolved into its aftermath. She was writing rapidly, making notes. The estate recovery order will take several weeks to fully process. There are accounts to unfreeze, assets to locate and return. The artifact transfers are a separate proceeding, but today's vote establishes the precedent for all of it. She looked up. The Lestrange transaction will be referred to the DMLE. That one won't be resolved quickly. I know, Harry said. Dumbledore will file a counter-argument on the wartime instruments question. His legal team will, I know, Harry said again, and there was nothing impatient in it, just the acknowledgement of someone who has already mapped the path several steps further than the current moment. He looked at the briefcase in Augusta's hand. Did we get what we came for today? Augusta looked at him steadily. Yes. Then we're on track. He turned to Griphook. The Lestrange account, can the bank provide a certified trace on the instrument's current location? We can try. Dark artifacts move through channels that are deliberately obscured. Griphook paused. It'll take time. That's fine. Harry looked back down the corridor toward the chamber doors, behind which the political aftermath of the morning was still playing out in all its complicated, consequential detail, and his expression was not triumphant, because triumph was an emotion for completed things, and this was nowhere near complete. It was the expression of a calculation continuing. I want to know where it is, he said. Not because I can do anything about it right now. Because I want to know. I'll start the trace, Griphook said. Augusta was watching Harry with the expression she'd worn since their first meeting, the one that had grief in it, the way approval sometimes does. Your parents would be, please don't, Harry said, and his voice was quiet and not unkind, just honest. Not today. Tell me after it's finished. Augusta closed her mouth. Nodded. They walked back toward the lifts together, through the ministry's wide, intimidating corridors, past the golden fireplaces and the bureaucratic cheerfulness and the architecture of institutional scale, and Harry looked at all of it with the same bright, cataloging attention he'd brought when they walked in, but it was different now, the attention, less inventory, more something else. The look of someone marking territory not with aggression but with the simple, unignorable fact of being present and intending to continue being present. The lift came. They got in. As the doors closed and the lift began to ascend, Harry reached into his robes and produced, of all things, the folded sheet of parchment on which he'd been keeping his 17 questions. He unfolded it, read the first one, made a small mark beside it, and folded it back up. Griphook looked at him sideways. One down. One answered, Harry said. The Wisengamot follows evidence when the evidence is clear enough and public enough that pretending otherwise costs them more than it saves them. He pocketed the parchment. I wanted to know if that was true. And now you know. And now I know. The lift reached the atrium and opened. Harry stepped out into the vast black floor, the golden fireplaces, the statue. He looked at the statue for a moment, the winged figures, the inscription, the whole elaborate architecture of a power that had believed itself untouchable until this morning. What's question 2? Augusta asked. Harry's mouth curved again, fuller this time, with the particular quality of someone who has been thinking about this for a while and is genuinely pleased with the direction it's taking. That one's about Narcissa Malfoy, he said. Augusta stopped walking. I beg your pardon. She reached out to Ragnarok last week, Harry said. She has information about the Lestrange transaction. Apparently she's had it for some time and has been looking for the right moment to use it. He looked at Augusta. I think now is the right moment. Augusta stared at him. She's someone who was married into a family that's connected to the darkest parts of what Dumbledore sold, and she has her own reasons for wanting those connections documented publicly, Harry said. Whatever her motivations, the information is real. The bank verified the preliminary details yesterday. You've already started verifying it, Augusta said flatly. Yesterday, Harry confirmed, entirely unrepentant. Augusta looked at Griphook with an expression that was the most undisguised thing Griphook had ever seen on her face, a helpless, genuine amusement that she was losing the battle to contain. "This is your fault," she told him. "Almost certainly," Griphook agreed. Harry was already moving toward the fireplaces, because there was another meeting today. There was always another meeting, and the morning had answered one question and opened 3 more, and the evidence package was sitting in the hands of 500 people, and the case was running, and the momentum was real, and somewhere above them in the wizarding world, in the aftermath of the vote, things were shifting in ways that would take time to fully see. But they were shifting. Harry could feel it the way you feel a current change direction, not the surface chop of the water but the deeper pull, the thing moving underneath. He stepped into the fire, green flames taking him, and was gone. Chapter 4. What was sold? Narcissa Malfoy arrived at Gringotts on a Tuesday, which she had selected with the same attention she brought to everything. Tuesdays were when the ministry's liaison officer made his weekly visit to the bank's upper floors, which meant the ministry would know she'd come and would spend the week wondering why, which suited her purposes precisely. She was not what Harry had expected. He had built a picture from the archive records and the Wisengamot membership files and the 2 paragraphs Griphook had given him when relaying Ragnarok's message about her inquiry. Malfoy family, pure blood, married to Lucius Malfoy, who was currently in an extremely complicated legal position following the collapse of several dark alliances in the aftermath of Voldemort's first fall. Connected to the Lestrange family through a network of social and financial ties that the tribunal summary had mapped but not fully explored. Motivated, Griphook had said, by something she hadn't named explicitly but which was evident in the precision of her preliminary communication. The picture he'd built was of someone cold and strategic and performing confidence she didn't entirely feel. The woman who walked into Ragnarok's office was cold and strategic and performing absolutely nothing. The confidence was real, and it was the specific confidence of someone who has decided to do a dangerous thing and has made their peace with the danger well in advance of doing it. She was tall, pale, blonde in a way that was almost severe, and she wore grey robes that managed to be simultaneously understated and expensive in the way that real money always was. She looked at Harry when she came in, and her expression didn't shift, but her eyes did something, a rapid assessment, a recalibration, the same upward revision that Harry had been producing in people since he was 3 years old. She sat down across the table from him and said, "You're younger than I expected." "You're more direct than I expected," Harry said. Something in her expression moved, not quite a smile, but the suggestion that one existed somewhere in the architecture of her face. "I don't have time to be indirect," she said. "Neither do you, I imagine, given what happened at the Wisengamot last week." "What did you hear about that?" "That the vote was decisive, that Dumbledore's legal team filed a preliminary counter-challenge within 6 hours, and that 3 members who voted against you are now reconsidering their position after conversations with people whose names I can give you if they're useful." She opened the bag she'd brought, not a briefcase, a leather portfolio, dark and worn at the corners in the way of something used rather than displayed, and placed a sealed folder on the table. "This is what I came to provide. I'll tell you what's in it and then you can decide how you want to use it." Griphook sat forward. "Before you do, why?" Narcissa looked at him. "Because I have a son," she said, simply and without drama, "and the instrument described on page 47 of your evidence package is currently in the possession of someone who knows where I live." The room was quiet for a moment. "The Lestrange holding account," Harry said. "The Lestrange holding account," Narcissa confirmed, "received more than one item through Dumbledore's network. Your package documents 1. I can document 3 more." She touched the sealed folder. 2 of them are dark instruments of the type that are activated by proximity rather than intent, meaning they don't require someone to choose to use them, they require someone to be near the right person at the right time. One of those 2 instruments has a secondary targeting clause. She paused. The secondary clause targets blood-adjacent heirs. Harry looked at Griphook. Griphook looked at the folder. "Your son," Harry said. "Draco is 8 years old," Narcissa said, and her voice was exactly level, with the levelness of someone who has been holding something at precisely that pitch for a very long time. "He did not choose his family's associations. Neither did you. She met Harry's eyes. I'm not asking for anything in exchange for this. I'm not requesting protection or immunity or any arrangement of that kind. I am providing evidence because the evidence removes a threat, and the threat is to my child, and that is sufficient motivation for whatever risk this creates for me. Harry looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was an assessment rather than a challenge, and then he said, "Open the folder." She opened it. The contents were, as she had described, meticulously documented. Narcissa Malfoy had, it emerged over the next 2 hours, been quietly and methodically building a case of her own for approximately 4 years, working from the inside of a social network that gave her access to information that no external investigator could have reached. She had financial records obtained through her own family's banking accounts. The Blacks had a complex relationship with the Lestrange family, connected through marriage and old alliances, and Narcissa's access to certain shared account records had given her a window into transactions that the tribunal's external trace had not been able to fully map. She had correspondence, letters, carefully preserved, between individuals whose names appeared in the tribunal summary in ways that now acquired new context and new weight. She had, most significantly, the registration documents for the 3 additional instruments transferred to the Lestrange accounts, including the technical specifications that identified exactly what they were and exactly what they did. Griphook read the technical specifications twice, and on the second reading he set the documents down with the deliberate care of someone who needs a moment before they continue. "These are old," he said. Pre-statute of secrecy. The manufacturing tradition for instruments of this type was supposed to have been destroyed. It was supposed to have been, Narcissa agreed. It wasn't. Where were they made? That I don't know. I know they were in the Lestrange family vaults before the war, and I know they were removed from those vaults and delivered to a third party sometime in 1982 or 1983, and I know that delivery was facilitated through the same holding account structure your tribunal documented. She paused. I don't know where they are now. That's the part one can't document. Harry had been reading while they talked, moving through the correspondence with the focused speed he brought to documents, and he looked up now. "This letter," he said, pointing to one of the preserved pieces of correspondence. Second paragraph. "The arrangements are as agreed, and our mutual friend has confirmed the timing will suit. The items will be in place before the boy reaches school age." Who wrote this? Narcissa looked at the letter. "The handwriting is Rodolphus Lestrange's," she said. "I've seen it enough to know." "And the mutual friend?" "I don't know with certainty." A pause. "I have a strong suspicion I'm not prepared to state as fact." "State it as a suspicion," Harry said. Narcissa looked at him steadily. The phrase mutual friend was used by Lucius in correspondence with Dumbledore during the early 1980s to refer to someone they were both in contact with. Someone in a senior ministry position who was facilitating certain transitions after the war, managing which alliances survived and which didn't, which families faced scrutiny and which were quietly cleared. Another pause. "I'm not saying Dumbledore and Lucius were collaborating. I'm saying they had a shared contact who was managing both of them." The room was quiet. "A ministry official," Griphook said. "A very senior one." Harry looked at the letter again. "Before the boy reaches school age." He was 10. School age was 11, in wizarding terms, Hogwarts opened at 11. The letter was dated 1983 and he was 3 years old then, which put school age 8 years away from the letter's date, which meant either the timeline had been extended significantly or the phrase was vaguer than it seemed. Or the items were already in place. "Griphook," he said, in the quiet tone that Griphook recognized as his working voice. "The proximity-activated instruments. If they were placed somewhere, a location rather than carried by a person, where would you put something you wanted to activate when a specific child arrived at a specific place?" Griphook was very still for a moment. Then, Hogwarts. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Narcissa's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I've considered that possibility," she said. "It's more than a possibility," Harry said. He was looking at the technical specifications now, reading the activation conditions. Look at the range. Proximity activation within a fixed boundary, targeted bloodline. If you placed this inside a large enclosed magical environment, a school, specifically a school with extensive ancient wards, the ambient magic of the building would amplify the activation range. He set the page down. Someone put these things at Hogwarts before I was supposed to go there. We don't know that, Griphook said carefully. We have enough to investigate it, Harry said. Which is what matters right now. He looked at Narcissa. Your son is enrolled at Hogwarts. He will be, next year, Narcissa said. He's been accepted. Then this isn't just about me, Harry said. No, Narcissa said quietly. It isn't. Harry looked at the folder, the correspondence, the technical specifications, the registration documents, and he thought about a letter that said in place before the boy reaches school age and a school that was the oldest magical building in Britain and a transaction that had been facilitated by someone who was simultaneously corresponding with both a dark family and the most powerful man in wizarding Britain, and he thought about all the ways the word sold could encompass things beyond gold and artifacts, the ways it could describe an arrangement in which a child's safety was a variable to be managed rather than a thing to be protected. I need you to testify, he said to Narcissa. Not immediately. When the timing is right. But I need you on record. Narcissa had clearly been expecting this, because she didn't hesitate. I know, she said. I want conditions. Name them. My son is not mentioned by name in any public filing. The connection to the targeting clause is documented in the sealed tribunal record only, the public version references it generically. She met his eyes. He's 8. He doesn't need to read his own name in the prophet next to the words dark instrument and bloodline targeting. Harry nodded immediately. Done. And I want access to the full trace results when the bank completes them. I want to know where those instruments are. Her voice was still level, still controlled. Not because I intend to do anything unauthorized. Because I want to be able to sleep. I'll authorize it, Griphook said, looking at Harry, who nodded again. Narcissa looked at Harry for a moment, the same kind of look he'd given her, assessment rather than challenge, and something in her face shifted slightly, the way a room shifts when a door opens somewhere and the air changes. You're not what Lucius described, she said. What did he describe? A problem to be managed. She gathered her folder and her portfolio with the efficient movements of someone who has accomplished what they came to accomplish. He was wrong. He was right that I'm a problem, Harry said. He was wrong about the managed part. This time the not-quite smile was more definite. She stood. I'll be in contact through the bank's secure correspondence system. When you need the testimony, send a formal request. I want everything documented, nothing informal. Agreed. She left, and the room held her absence the way rooms hold the presence of forceful people after they depart, a slight readjustment, a settling. Ragnarok, who had been silent at the head of the table since the meeting began, spoke for the first time. The Hogwarts question needs to be addressed carefully, he said. If dark instruments are placed within the school's physical structure, the mechanism for their removal is not straightforward. The building has its own wards and the headmaster controls access to. He stopped. The headmaster controls access, Harry said. Who is the headmaster? A pause. Currently, Armando Dip-Pet, Ragnarok said. But Dumbledore has been deputy headmaster for over a decade. His influence on the building's wards and access protocols is significant. So the person who sold the instruments and the person who controls access to the place where they might be stored are connected, Harry said. Or the same person made both arrangements, Griphook said. Harry sat back. The room was quiet with the weight of it. He looked at the technical specifications still on the table and thought about next year, about 11, about a school he had never been to but which had been the frame of reference for every adult conversation about his future since he was old enough to understand what Hogwarts was. I'm not going there, he said. Both Ragnock and Griphook looked at him. "I'm not going to Hogwarts next year," Harry said, with the calm of someone stating a decision rather than proposing one. "Not until those instruments are located and removed. I'm not walking into a building with unknown dark artifacts targeted at my bloodline because the calendar says it's time. The Hogwarts letter is a legal expectation under British wizarding law," Ragnock said carefully. "Then we addressed that legally," Harry said. "Home education provisions exist. The law provides for them." He looked at Griphook. "We checked, right?" "We checked," Griphook confirmed, because they had, 2 years ago, as part of the comprehensive survey of Harry's legal position that they'd conducted after the Wisengamot hearing. A petition for alternative magical education under the Home Provision Act of 1947 requires documentation of specific circumstances that make attendance impractical or unsafe. The circumstances we have would qualify. "File it," Harry said. "It will draw attention," Ragnock said. "Harry Potter refusing Hogwarts will be a significant story." "Good," Harry said. "I want the attention on why I'm refusing. I want the story to be, Potter heir declines Hogwarts attendance pending investigation into placement of dark instruments within school structure. I want that sentence in the Prophet." He paused. "The investigation needs to happen. The school needs to be searched. And the person who controls access to the wards needs to either authorize the search or explain publicly why he won't." Ragnock looked at him for a long moment. "You want to use the refusal as leverage." "I want to use the refusal as what it is," Harry said. "A reasonable decision made by a person who has specific evidence that a specific location may contain items specifically designed to harm him. And then I want the world to watch what Dumbledore does with it." Ragnock's expression did the thing it sometimes did, the almost movement that in another face would have been admiration. "The Home Provision petition will be filed," he said. "I'll assign our best legal drafter." "There's one more thing," Harry said. He reached into the folder Narcissa had left and pulled out the letter, Rodolphus Lestrange's handwriting, second paragraph, the mutual friend. The ministry official. The shared contact. We need to identify them. That investigation goes beyond the bank's jurisdiction, Griphook said. "I know. But we have something they don't." Harry placed the letter on the table. The phrase mutual friend appears in Lestrange's correspondence. If it also appears in Dumbledore's correspondence with the ministry, in the same period, with the same context, then we have a triangulation point. Whose office would that correspondence go through? Griphook thought about this. The minister's records department keeps copies of all formal correspondence. But informal, Narcissa said Lucius used the phrase in letters to Dumbledore, Harry interrupted. "She's seen those letters. Which means those letters exist. Which means they're somewhere." He looked at Griphook. "Where do private letters go when the writer is under legal investigation?" Griphook was quiet for a moment. "If Lucius Malfoy's assets were seized pending investigation, his private correspondence would be in ministry custody," he said slowly. "In the evidence archives." "Can the bank request access?" "Not directly. But the Wisengamot can compel disclosure of evidence materials during an ongoing case." Griphook paused. "We have an ongoing case." "Augusta can file the motion," Harry said. "She filed 3 last week and she seemed like she was enjoying herself." "She was," Griphook confirmed, because Augusta's expression during the filing process had been the expression of a person doing something they were exceptionally good at after a long time of waiting for the right occasion to do it. They worked for another 2 hours, building the structure of what needed to happen next, the home provision petition, the motion for disclosure of the Malfoy correspondence, the formal referral to the DMLE on the additional instruments Narcissa had documented. Griphook made notes and Harry made different notes and Ragnock watched them both with the patient, iron-eyed attention of someone managing a very complex operation that is running exactly as it should. When they broke, Harry went to his chambers to eat, because Goldthorn had sent a message that morning that contained the phrase "You are a growing child and I will not have you skipping meals for strategy sessions" in terms that made it clear she was prepared to enforce this with whatever medical authority was available to her, and Harry had learned several years ago that this was a battle not worth having. He ate at the writing desk because he was reading while he ate, which Goldthorn also had opinions about, but she couldn't be everywhere at once. The document in front of him was the complete technical specification for the proximity-activated instruments that Narcissa had provided, and he read it the way he read everything, not just for content but for what the content implied about the person who'd made the thing, the tradition it came from, the understanding of magic that had produced it. The instruments were old. Pre-statute, as Griphook had said, which meant they'd been made before the magical and non-magical worlds had been formally separated, in an era when dark magic had been practiced more openly and with less concern for documentation. The manufacturing tradition they came from used something called blood keying, the process of attaching an artifact's activation conditions to specific magical bloodlines, so that the artifact responded to the presence of that blood the way a lock responds to a key. The instruments were designed to activate, to release their effect, when the keyed bloodline came within range. The effect, in this case, was the voiding of inherited magical protections. The systematic dismantling of the enchantments and wards that a family accumulated across generations, the things that sat in the blood and the bone and made a person harder to hurt in ways they often didn't even know about. You voided those and the person became, magically speaking, more vulnerable in ways that were difficult to identify or address because the protections that had been removed had often been placed so long ago nobody remembered they existed. Harry ate his dinner and thought about what it meant to have those instruments at Hogwarts and to be sent there at 11, alone, not knowing any of this, not knowing what had been taken already, not knowing about the transaction on page 47. He thought about how it would have gone. He thought about it for approximately 45 seconds and then he put the technical specification face down on the desk and looked at the atrium garden through the window, where the phosphorescent plants were cycling through their evening patterns, and he breathed through something that was not quite anger and not quite grief but had elements of both, the feeling of a path that had been set for him in advance and that he had, through a combination of a goblin's professional thoroughness and a brass compass on a rainy night, somehow stepped sideways off. He turned the specification back over and kept reading. The next morning brought two things in quick succession. The first was a formal letter from the Ministry of Magic, addressed to Harry Potter, the Potter Estate, care of Gringotts Bank, which opened with a great deal of procedural language and arrived eventually at the information that the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement was initiating a review of the Lestrange account transactions in connection with the Wisengamot proceedings, and wished to interview Mr. Potter at his earliest convenience. The second was a personal letter, written on Hogwarts stationery in a slanted, elegant hand, which said simply, "I understand you have questions. I believe we should speak before matters proceed further. I would welcome the opportunity to explain." Harry read both letters at the breakfast table while Goldthorn watched him with the expression of someone who knows better than to ask. He put the ministry letter to his left. He held the Hogwarts letter for a moment, looking at it, the careful handwriting, the "I believe we should speak," the opportunity to explain, and thought about Griphook saying he'll try to be disarming and about the concession at the Wisengamot and about a blood authorization filed 4 days after a transaction. He wrote 2 replies. To the Ministry, Mr. Potter will meet with DMLE representatives at Gringotts on a date to be confirmed, with his legal representative present. Short, courteous, controlling the venue. To Dumbledore, I'm available on Thursday at 3 o'clock. Come to Gringotts. Bring the authorization records for the 1983 Lestrange transaction, specifically the original instrument of transfer, in whatever form it exists. Nothing else. No pleasantries, no acknowledgement of the opportunity to explain. Just the time and the specific document. He sealed both, addressed them, handed them to the morning courier, and finished his breakfast. Griphook appeared in the doorway as the courier left. He looked at Harry with the sharp-eyed attention of someone who has noticed a development and is deciding how he feels about it. "The Dumbledore letter," he said. "He's coming Thursday." A pause. "You could have consulted me." "I'm telling you now," Harry said. He was going to reach out, you said so yourself, years ago. He's done it. And if he brings the original transfer document, we'll have something we don't have yet, his own version of what happened. In his handwriting. Under his seal. Griphook came into the room and sat down, looking at Harry with the expression that meant he was doing two things simultaneously, assessing the decision and deciding he agreed with it. He might not come, Griphook said. He'll come, Harry said. Because not coming looks like what it is. And if he comes without the document? Then we know the document doesn't support his version of events, which we already suspected. Harry pushed his empty plate aside. Either way, Thursday is useful. Griphook was quiet for a moment. I want to be in that meeting. Obviously. And Augusta should be briefed beforehand. I already wrote to her, Harry said, and pointed to a second sealed letter on the table. Griphook looked at it, looked at Harry, and exhaled through his nose in a way that was, for him, the equivalent of someone throwing their hands up. You wrote 3 letters this morning before I arrived. I woke up early. Harry stood, picking up the technical specification. I've been reading Narcissa's documents. I want to talk through the activation mechanics with someone who knows dark artifact theory. Do you know who at the bank handles artifact authentication for restricted items? Sharpclaw, on the 5th level. Can you arrange a meeting this afternoon? Probably. Griphook paused. Why? Because the technical specification describes a secondary failsafe, Harry said, holding up the document. A deactivation condition. Which means these things can be turned off, not just physically removed. And the deactivation requires a specific magical signature. He pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the page, which is a blood-keyed signature. Which means the person whose blood was used to key the activation can also key the deactivation. Griphook went still. My blood, Harry said. The instruments are keyed to my bloodline for activation. If the deactivation uses the same key, then you can potentially deactivate them yourself, Griphook said. Without physically entering the building. If we can verify the mechanism, Harry said. And if we can confirm the instruments are actually at Hogwarts. Which we haven't done yet. He folded the specification and tucked it under his arm. But if both of those things are true, we don't need Dumbledore's cooperation to make the school safe. We don't need to petition him for access to the wards, and we don't need to wait for him to authorize a search. He met Griphook's eyes. We just need to know what we're doing. Griphook looked at him for a long moment, the look that had become over 10 years something Harry knew as precisely as he knew the atrium garden or the corridor to the archive, the look that was thorough and sharp, and underneath the professionalism was something warmer that neither of them named. You've been thinking about this since last night, Griphook said. Since the specification, Harry agreed. The deactivation clause is in a different script from the rest of the document. It was added later, by someone different. Which means whoever manufactured the secondary failsafe was not the same person who made the primary activation. Which means someone added an off switch that the original maker didn't intend. Someone who wanted an escape route, Griphook said. Or someone who was made to build the thing and built in a way to undo it. Harry paused. The craftsmanship of the failsafe is different from the primary mechanism. Cleaner. Less dark, if that makes sense as a technical description. It does, Griphook said. Instruments made under coercion or against the maker's values often have structural inconsistencies. The maker builds in what they can. He looked at the folded specification. This is old goblin-adjacent metalwork, Harry. Pre-statute. You'd need someone with specific expertise to authenticate the failsafe clause. Sharpclaw, Harry said. Sharpclaw, Griphook confirmed. The meeting with Sharpclaw was arranged for 2 o'clock, and it ran for 3 hours, because Sharpclaw was a goblin who had spent 60 years specializing in pre-statute dark artifact assessment and had the quality of an expert who has been waiting their entire career to encounter something interesting enough to justify their expertise, and the technical specification provided this almost immediately. Sharpclaw read it with a magnifying lens, made notes in a script Harry didn't recognize even after 6 years of gobbledygook study, asked 17 questions of his own, and confirmed by 4 o'clock that the failsafe mechanism was genuine, was structurally distinct from the primary manufacturing, and was keyed to precisely the same bloodline signature as the activation, meaning that Harry's blood, which had activated the sanguine compass 7 years ago in a cupboard under the stairs, was also the key to switching the instruments off. "Can it be done remotely?" Harry asked. "Without physical proximity to the instruments?" Sharpclaw looked at him over the magnifying lens. "In theory. The bloodline signature doesn't require the blood to be physically touching the instrument, it requires the signature to be present in a specific magical form." He tapped the failsafe clause. "This notation here is a transmission formula. Old working, but functional. If you created the appropriate signal, a blood-keyed magical broadcast, essentially, the instruments would respond to it within range." "What's the range?" "Depends on the ambient magical environment." Sharpclaw set down the specification. "In a place like Hogwarts, heavily warded, centuries of accumulated magical charge, the range would be significant. Possibly the entire structure." "So from outside the building," Harry said. "Possibly. It would require a precise working, and it would require your blood to be the active element." Sharpclaw looked at him steadily. "This is not standard magical practice. It would need to be constructed carefully. Tested. Can you help with that?" Sharpclaw looked at the specification, then at Harry, then at Griphook, who was standing to one side with his professional neutral expression, which Sharpclaw read the way all senior bank officers read it, accurately. "I can construct a theoretical framework," Sharpclaw said. "Whether it can be executed depends on variables we won't know until we try." A pause. "You're 10. The blood keying doesn't care how old I am," Harry said. "It cares whose blood it is." Sharpclaw made a sound that might have been acknowledgement and might have been something closer to amusement, put the specification carefully in a locked case, and said he would have a preliminary framework by next week. Thursday came with grey skies and the particular stillness of a day that knows something is going to happen in it. Dumbledore arrived at 3 o'clock precisely. Harry had expected this. Punctuality was its own message, the message being "I am entirely comfortable with this meeting," and he was already seated when Dumbledore was escorted in by 2 bank officers and Griphook, who positioned himself at Harry's left with the practiced ease of someone who has decided exactly where he's standing and why. Dumbledore looked the same as he had in the Wizengamot chamber, tall, silver-bearded, purple-robed, with the half-moon spectacles and the kind eyes. He looked at Harry and those kind eyes were doing genuine work, assessing, recalibrating, the same upward revision everyone made, but processed differently, processed through whatever framework made Albus Dumbledore see a 10-year-old and feel something that, to Harry's reading, sat between genuine regret and recalculated strategy. "Harry," he said, and his voice was warm in the way a fireplace is warm, immediate and enveloping. "I'm glad you agreed to meet." "Sit down," Harry said. Dumbledore sat. He placed his hands on the table, unhurried, and looked at Harry with the expression of a man who is preparing to be honest. It was, Harry thought, an excellent performance of honesty. He had learned, from years of ledger reading, that the best forgeries were the ones that looked exactly like the genuine article. "Did you bring the transfer document?" Harry asked. Dumbledore's expression shifted slightly. "The original instrument of transfer for the 1983 Lestrange transaction is, I'm afraid, no longer in my possession. It was filed with, where?" A pause. "With a legal representative whose office has since closed. The records would be, I'm going to stop you," Harry said, not unkindly, just precisely. "Because the original transfer document either exists or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, that's actually more informative than if it does. So the fact that you've come without it, and you're explaining why you don't have it rather than simply saying I couldn't find it or it was destroyed, that tells me the document contains something that doesn't support what you're going to tell me today." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "I'm 10, Harry said. "I know I'm 10. But I've been working on this case for 4 years, and the ledger doesn't care how old I am, and the dates don't change because I'm young, and a blood authorization filed 4 days after a transaction is still a blood authorization filed 4 days after a transaction. So I'd prefer, if you're willing, that we skip the part where you explain the context that changes what the numbers mean, and go straight to what you actually want to say. Something happened in Dumbledore's face. Not the recalibration, that had already happened, but something deeper, something that was genuine in a way the warmth hadn't been. It was, Harry thought, the expression of someone who has been very careful for a very long time and has just encountered something careful enough to meet them. "You're very like your mother," Dumbledore said. "You're the third person who's told me that," Harry said. "Go ahead." Dumbledore looked at his hands on the table for a moment. When he spoke again, the warm fireplace quality was still there, but it had a different character, less performed, more considered. "The measures I took with the estate were not, as your documentation shows, legally clean," he said. "I've acknowledged that publicly and I acknowledge it here. What I want to explain, what I believe you deserve to understand, is the landscape in which those decisions were made." "Tell me about the Lestrange transaction specifically," Harry said. "The other things I'm willing to discuss context for. Not that one." A pause. "The Lestrange transaction was, what was sold," Harry said. "What it does. Who it was sold to. Those 3 things." Dumbledore looked at him steadily for a moment, and in that moment the kind eyes were doing something more complex than kindness. They were deciding something, weighing something, and Harry watched the decision happen with the focused attention of someone reading a very important document. The instrument in question was recovered from a property connected to Voldemort's operations following the events of 1981, Dumbledore said. "It was in the possession of parties who wished to use it. I arranged for it to be transferred to the Lestrange accounts because the Lestranges were about to be arrested and their assets seized, which meant the instrument would pass into ministry custody, which I judged to be less secure than private, monitored custody under a family with no freedom of movement." "You gave it to people being arrested," Harry said. "I gave it to people whose assets would be frozen immediately after their arrest," Dumbledore said. "It was, you gave it to people being arrested," Harry said again, with the same tone, letting the sentence be what it was without the framing around it. Dumbledore was quiet. "And the authorization for that transfer was filed on your signature," Harry said. "Using instruments that were no longer legally valid. Using a blood confirmation for a 3-year-old that was filed 4 days after the transaction." He paused. "The ministry custody argument doesn't explain the falsified authorization." "No," Dumbledore said. "It doesn't." The admission landed quietly. No frame, no context. Just the word. Harry looked at him for a moment. Then, "Do you know where the instrument is now?" "I believe it to be in a secure location," Dumbledore said. "Hogwarts," Harry said. A pause. It lasted 2 seconds, which in a conversation of this precision was an enormous amount of time. "There are items within Hogwarts that require careful management," Dumbledore said. "Items whose presence is known to me and whose security is. I'm not going to Hogwarts," Harry said. "I filed the home provision petition. It'll be formally approved next week." He watched Dumbledore absorb this. "I'm also having the deactivation mechanism in the transfer instrument specification analyzed. We believe it can be executed remotely. We're going to test that." He paused. "I wanted to tell you that directly, because I think you should know that whatever arrangement you've made about the security of those items, it's going to change." Dumbledore looked at him, and for the first time in the meeting, the kind eyes showed something that was not strategy or performance or warmth or recalibration but something altogether more human and less comfortable, something that was almost fear, and not fear for himself. "Harry," he said, and the name had a weight in it now. "Some of those items, the situation is more complex than you're seeing it as. There are things in that building that I have kept contained not to harm you but to manage," Harry said. "I know. I've heard that word applied to me a lot." He stood up. "I don't need managing, Professor. I need the instruments removed. I need the estate returned. I need the Lestrange transaction investigated fully. And I need whoever the shared contact was, the one you and Lucius Malfoy both corresponded with using the phrase mutual friend, to be identified and named. He looked at Dumbledore across the table with the steady, green, unimpressed gaze that had been developed across 10 years in the company of goblins and ledgers and the kind of absolute honesty that comes from never being allowed to pretend the numbers say something they don't. I'm not angry at you, Harry said, and he meant it, and that was somehow worse than anger. I'm just going to keep going until this is finished. That's all. He walked to the door, opened it, and stopped. The cloak is in my vault, he said, without turning around. I looked at it yesterday for the first time. I understand now why it was flagged as sovereign. A pause. My mother had good instincts. He walked out. In the room behind him, Albus Dumbledore sat at the granite table with his hands folded and his expression doing something that nobody was there to read, and Griphook, who had been silent at Harry's left for the entire meeting, gathered his notes and walked to the door and paused there for a moment. You should know, Griphook said, not turning around, addressing the room in the general direction of the man at the table, that the bank-certified evidence package has already been submitted to 3 international wizarding legal bodies. Not for action. For record. He paused. In case anyone was considering the possibility that this matter might be resolved quietly after all. He left. In the corridor, Harry was standing with his back against the wall, not quite leaning, not quite still, the posture of someone who has done a hard thing and is giving themselves 30 seconds to breathe before the next one. Griphook stopped beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The fear, Harry said. At the end. It wasn't for himself. No, Griphook said. What is he actually afraid of in that school? Griphook thought about the sovereign artifacts in the Potter vault, and about old stories, and about the night Harry had first read the technical specification and said pre-statute, different craftsmanship, someone added an off switch. He thought about conversations they'd had and conversations they hadn't yet had, and about a compass that had gone gold in a cupboard under the stairs and had been pointing in one direction ever since. I think, Griphook said carefully, that Hogwarts has more than dark instruments in it. Harry looked at him. How much more? That, Griphook said, is a conversation for tomorrow. Tonight you should sleep. Harry looked like he was going to argue, and then he looked at Griphook's expression, and he didn't argue. Tomorrow, then, he said. Tomorrow, Griphook confirmed. They walked back toward the residential levels, the bank humming around them, the evidence vaults holding their certified truths, the atrium garden glowing through the stone, and somewhere above them in the wizarding world the afternoon was turning toward evening and 3 international legal bodies had a package on their desks and a home provision petition was moving through its approval process and Narcissa Malfoy was sitting in her grey-walled house waiting for the information that would let her sleep, and in a corridor beneath London a 10-year-old boy who had been pulled out of a cupboard by a brass compass was walking through his home with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are and exactly where they're going. The gold light pulsed once in the vault below, deep in the stone, the way it did sometimes, regular as a heartbeat. Chapter 5, The Reckoning. The framework Sharpclaw produced was 14 pages of dense technical notation that Harry read 3 times and then translated, roughly, for Griphook. The remote deactivation was possible, it was precise, and it required a working that had not been formally performed in recorded goblin history but which was theoretically sound in every particular that Sharpclaw could verify. The blood-keyed broadcast needed 3 elements, a prepared vessel, a specific incantation in pre-statute Latin, and a sustained magical output that Sharpclaw described in clinical terms and Harry read as it will take everything you have and possibly more. Can I do it? Harry asked. Sharpclaw looked at him with the magnifying lens still in hand. Your bloodline signature is the key. Whether you have the magical output required, he tilted his head, is a question I cannot answer from theory. You would need to test the vessel working first. Build toward it. How long? Weeks, if you work consistently. Perhaps a month. I have until September, Harry said. Hogwarts term starts in September. If the instruments are there and they activate on proximity, the first students through those doors next autumn are at risk, Sharpclaw said. Yes. Harry looked at the 14 pages. Let's start today. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Harry would remember later, not as a linear sequence of events but as a sustained pressure, like weather, the kind of continuous, full attention work that meant falling asleep mid-thought and waking up with the next thought already formed. He worked with Sharpclaw on the vessel construction every afternoon. He worked with Griphook on the legal proceedings every morning. Augusta filed 3 more motions and won 2 of them. The DMLE interviewed Harry at Gringotts with 2 officers who were professional and thorough and who left, Griphook reported afterward, with an expression Harry recognized as the same one Augusta had worn reading page 47 for the first time. The home provision petition was approved. This produced exactly the story Harry had wanted: Potter heir declines Hogwarts, dark instrument investigation cited. The Prophet ran it on the front page with a subheading that referenced the Wisingamot vote and a photograph that Harry had not provided but which the paper's photographer had apparently taken outside the ministry on the day of the hearing. He looked, in the photograph, like someone who was going somewhere and was not particularly interested in whether the camera was ready. The letters that arrived after the article were, in volume and variety, remarkable. Griphook sorted them into categories that ranged from supportive and relevant through supportive and irrelevant to hostile and interesting, and finally to a small stack marked legal concern, forward to Augusta. Several of the last category came from names that appeared in the tribunal summary, and one of them came from a name that appeared in the Malfoy correspondence file under the phrase mutual friend. That one came in on a Wednesday morning and Harry read it at the breakfast table and then read it again and then took it immediately to Griphook's office and put it on the desk. Griphook read it. Then he went very still in the way he did when something was significant and he was deciding how significant. Cornelius Fudge, Harry said. Junior Minister for Magical Accidents and Catastrophes in 1982 and 1983. His name appears in 3 of the Malfoy-Dumbledore letters that Augusta's motion compelled the ministry to release. He sat down across from Griphook. He's written to tell me that I've been misinformed about the circumstances of my family's estate management, and that he would be willing to meet and provide clarifying documentation. He's worried, Griphook said. He's terrified, Harry said. Read the second paragraph. He's offering documentation proactively. Nobody offers documentation proactively unless they're trying to get ahead of documentation someone else has. Griphook read the second paragraph. He wants to control what we learn about his role. By telling us his version first and making it look like cooperation. Harry took the letter back. But the fact that he's reached out means he knows we have the letters. Which means someone in the Ministry Evidence Archive told him the disclosure motion had been executed. He paused. Which means he has an informant in the ministry who monitors requests for his correspondence. That's a significant thing to have, Griphook said. That's a significant thing to need, Harry corrected. He wrote back to Fudge the same afternoon. Not to agree to a meeting, not yet, but to acknowledge receipt and express that he found the offer of documentation potentially useful and would be in touch. Short, non-committal, leaving Fudge in exactly the anxious middle ground of not knowing whether he'd helped himself or made things worse. Then he wrote to Augusta and told her to prepare a deposition request. The vessel for the remote deactivation working was a sphere of goblin silver about the size of a large marble, engraved with the specific notation Sharpclaw had designed over 2 weeks of careful work. The engraving was done with a tool that was older than the bank's current building, and Sharpclaw handled it with the reverence of someone using an instrument they'd spent a lifetime waiting for a reason to use. The sphere sat on a workbench in the artifact authentication room on the 5th level, and Harry spent 2 hours a day working with it, building what Sharpclaw described as sympathetic resonance, the process of aligning the vessel with his own magical signature so that when the moment came, the broadcast would be clean and complete. It felt, at first, like pushing against something that wasn't there. Then like pushing against something that was listening. Then, by the 3rd week, like reaching out and finding something that reached back. How does it feel? Sharpclaw asked on a Wednesday afternoon. Like it knows me, Harry said. Sharpclaw looked at him over the magnifying lens. "That's correct," he said. "That's exactly correct. How will I know when I'm ready?" "You'll know," Sharpclaw said, which was the most mystical thing the artifact specialist had ever said, and Harry looked at him with mild surprise. Sharpclaw shrugged, which was a very non-goblin gesture. "Some things can't be quantified. When you're ready, you'll feel it. The vessel will respond fully, not partially, not with resistance. Fully." Harry looked at the silver sphere, sitting in the engraved groove Sharpclaw had made for it, catching the crystal light. "And then I just need to be close enough to Hogwarts. Within a mile should suffice, given the ambient magical charge of the building." Sharpclaw paused. "What you'll feel during the working, it won't be comfortable. The blood-keyed broadcast requires a genuine expenditure. Not dangerous, but not gentle either." "I know," Harry said. "You know because you read the specification." "I know because I've been doing this for 3 weeks and I can already feel what it's building toward," Harry said. "It's fine. I can handle it." Sharpclaw looked at him for a moment with an expression that contained something not entirely professional. "I believe you," he said. In the 4th week, 3 things happened in the same 5-day period that compressed the timeline in ways Harry had planned for but not entirely anticipated. The first was the completion of the artifact trace. The bank's tracing team, working from the registration documents Narcissa had provided and the transaction records in the tribunal summary, confirmed the location of all 4 instruments, 3 at Hogwarts, placed within the building's structural wards in the lower levels, and the one keyed to Harry's bloodline with the secondary clause targeting blood-adjacent heirs, in a private vault in Diagon Alley registered to a name that had appeared exactly once before in the case file, in a footnote on page 81 of the tribunal summary, listed as a minor account holder with no apparent significance. Griphook spent 40 minutes with the name and the registration records and came to Harry's practice space, where Harry was working through movement sequences, and said, "The private vault is registered to a trust account controlled by Albus Dumbledore on behalf of an individual recorded only as TMR." Harry stopped moving. "TMR. We can't identify it further from the records available. The trust structure obscures the beneficiary." Harry thought about this for a moment. "It's not at Hogwarts," he said. "He kept it separate." "The one with the blood-adjacent targeting clause," Griphook confirmed. "Which is the most directly threatening to you?" "He kept it somewhere he controls directly." "Which means he can use it," Harry said. "Or threaten to use it. Or ensure it isn't used without his authorization," Griphook said carefully. "I'm not certain which reading is correct. What was in the vault otherwise? The trace only confirms the instrument's presence. We can't inventory the full vault without a blood rights access order, which requires a Wisengamot motion," Harry said. "How fast can Augusta file it?" "If I call her in the next 10 minutes, she could have it filed before the clerk's office closes today." "Call her," Harry said, and was already moving toward the door. The second thing was the letter from Narcissa. It arrived the next morning, through the bank's secure correspondence system, and it was longer than any communication she had sent before. She wrote, spoken with someone, she didn't name them, but the description was specific enough that Harry read it as someone inside Dumbledore's immediate circle who has recently become less inside it, and she had learned 2 things. The first was that Dumbledore was aware of the artifact trace and had petitioned the Ministry to classify the vault contents as sensitive magical security materials, which would block the blood rights access order if the classification went through. The second was that there was a meeting scheduled, not formal, not documented, between Dumbledore and 2 members of the Wisengamot on the evening of the following Thursday. Members whose names were on Harry's color-coded diagram in the loyal column. He read the letter twice, then wrote a single-sentence reply, "Thank you. File your testimony with the bank's tribunal secretary today." She filed it that afternoon. The third thing was a knock on the door of Harry's chambers at 10 o'clock on a Thursday evening, which was Griphook, which was unusual enough that Harry was already standing when the door opened. "The Ministry classification petition was filed this afternoon," Griphook said. 2 hours ago. It'll be heard on Monday. Augusta can challenge it, Harry said. She already knows. She's drafting the challenge now. Griphook paused. But the classification petition names the vault contents as connected to an active national security concern. If they succeed in making that argument, the blood rights access order is suspended indefinitely. What's the security concern they're citing? The return of a dark entity. Griphook's voice was very flat. They're citing Voldemort. The name landed in the quiet room with the weight of something that had been present in the background for a long time and had just stepped into the foreground. Harry sat down on the edge of the bed, not from shock. He'd been reading about the Dark Lord since he was 7 and had followed the threads of the case far enough to understand that Voldemort was always there in the background, the original reason for the Potters' deaths, the context for everything that had happened in 1981, but because sitting helped him think. He's using Voldemort as a shield, Harry said. The argument will be that the vault contains materials relevant to national security in connection with the Dark Lord's potential return, and that public access, including blood rights access, would compromise that security. Griphook paused. It's not an argument without legal weight. Courts have suspended individual rights claims before on national security grounds. But it has to be substantiated, Harry said. They have to show the connection between the vault contents and the national security concern. In closed session, Griphook said. Which means the evidence isn't public. Harry was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the atrium garden cycled through its night patterns, the phosphorescent light slow and steady. He's protecting whatever's in that vault, Harry said. Not because it's a national security concern. Because it's his. TMR, Griphook said. We still don't know who that is. We know it's a person Dumbledore is managing, Harry said. The same way he managed me. Whatever's in that vault belongs to TMR and Dumbledore controls the trust, which means he controls the access, which means he controls whatever TMR can do with it. He paused. The instrument in that vault is the one that voids blood protections on adjacent heirs. If TMR is connected to Voldemort, then Dumbledore has been holding a dark instrument targeted at blood-adjacent heirs of the Potter line in a vault he controls, registered to a trust connected to the Dark Lord, Griphook said. And he's classifying it as national security to prevent anyone examining it. The silence was the kind that comes after a thing has been stated so clearly that there's nothing to add to it immediately. I'm doing the deactivation working on Saturday, Harry said. Sharpclaw said I'd know when I was ready, Harry said. I'm ready. He looked at the silver sphere on his desk, where it sat in its groove, catching the atrium light through the window. 3 instruments at Hogwarts, 1 in the vault. The 3 at Hogwarts I can reach remotely if I'm close enough. The 1 in the vault requires the access order, which is suspended pending the classification hearing, Griphook said. Unless I go to the vault, Harry said. Griphook was quiet. I have blood rights access to any vault in the bank that holds assets belonging to my estate, Harry said. That's Charter 9, Article 2. The blood rights access order we filed is the formal legal instrument, but the charter access is inherent, it exists independent of any petition or court order, because it's not granted by a court, it's granted by blood. Griphook was very quiet. The classification petition is filed with the ministry, Harry continued. The ministry can suspend a court-issued blood rights access order. But Charter 9 Article 2 isn't a court-issued order. It's a charter right. The ministry doesn't have jurisdiction over it. He paused. Do they? Griphook breathed through his nose for a moment. No, he said. They don't. So I can walk into that vault. The vault is registered to the trust account, not to your estate. Your charter access is to estate assets. Whether the instrument in that vault constitutes an estate asset, it was transferred from my family's accounts using falsified authorization, Harry said. It was listed in the tribunal findings as an asset wrongfully removed from the Potter estate. That classification is already on record. He met Griphook's eyes. It's mine. The tribunal said so. Another pause. Saturday, Griphook said. Saturday. I'm coming with you. Obviously. Saturday was still and grey, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself, that simply arrives. Harry woke early, ate breakfast because Goldthorn would find out if he didn't, and sat with the silver sphere for an hour in the quiet of his chambers before it was time to go. The resonance between the vessel and his own signature was complete now in the way Sharpclaw had described, not reaching, not pushing, just present, aligned, the way breathing is when you're not thinking about it. He put it in his pocket. Griphook met him at 7 outside his chambers, and they walked together through the bank's residential levels to the transit hall. Neither of them spoke on the way down. They had developed, over 11 years, a capacity for the kind of silence that was a form of communication rather than its absence, the silence of people who know each other well enough not to need words for everything, which is a rarer thing than it sounds. The transit brought them to a station point in Hogsmeade, which sat about 1.5 miles from the Hogwarts grounds, close enough for the ambient magical charge of the school to register as a warmth in the air, a specific quality of the morning that was like nothing else Harry had encountered. He stood outside the transit station and felt it and understood, for the first time, what it would have meant to arrive here at 11 not knowing any of what he knew. The warmth of it. The pull. He also felt the instruments. They were faint and distant and cold inside the warmth, the way a bad note is faint inside music. You might not notice it if you weren't listening, but once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. 3 distinct cold points in the east face of the building, low down, structural level. He felt them the way he'd felt the vessel responding to him over 3 weeks of work, the same register, the same language. I can feel them, he told Griphook. Griphook looked at him. Now. Now. Harry wrapped his hand around the sphere in his pocket, and the resonance sharpened immediately, the vessel aligning to what he was sensing the way a lens brings a blurred thing into focus. I need about 10 minutes of quiet. Griphook looked at the street around them, early morning Hogsmeade, a few shopkeepers opening up, nobody paying attention to 2 figures outside a transit station. You have it, he said. Harry stood on the cobblestones and held the sphere and sent his attention toward the school the way you'd send your hand toward something in the dark, carefully, feeling for edges, for the shape of the thing. The 3 instruments were clearer now. He could feel the blood keying, could feel his own signature in it, the lock recognizing the key before the key had been turned. The incantation was pre-statute Latin, which he had learned over 3 weeks until it was automatic, and he spoke it quietly, not for volume but for precision, each word clean and correctly formed. The sphere warmed in his hand, then grew warm, then became hot, not painfully, but significantly, the way a muscle becomes hot when it's working at the edge of what it can do. Sharpclaw had been right about what it felt like. It was not comfortable. It was the feeling of everything being drawn toward one point, like water going down a drain, like a breath being held past the easy part, and Harry held it because he could hold it, because he had been built for this kind of sustained specific effort by 11 years of being exactly this person in exactly these circumstances. The cold points in the school shifted. He felt them respond to the broadcast, the lock recognizing the key, the mechanism engaging. It happened in sequence, the first instrument, then the second, then the third, each one shifting from cold to neutral, from active to dormant, a sound not made of sound, a click not made of metal. Harry exhaled. The sphere in his hand was no longer hot. It was warm, then cooling, the way a lamp cools after it's switched off. Done, he said. Griphook looked at him. All 3. All 3. Griphook looked toward the school on the hill, the towers visible over the rooftops of Hogsmeade, the morning light hitting the stone. The vault, he said. The vault, Harry confirmed. They transited back to Gringotts. The vault level was 7 floors below ground, which meant a long descent in the cart system, the fast one, the one that took corners at speed and dropped between levels with the particular physics of a thing that has decided gravity is negotiable. Harry had ridden the vaults since he was small enough to need to hold the sides, and he held the sides now out of habit rather than necessity, thinking about the sphere in his pocket and the TMR trust account and the blood keying on the fourth instrument and what it meant that Dumbledore had kept that one separate. The cart stopped outside Vault 317, which was the trust account vault, and Harry stepped out and looked at the door. It was standard security, nothing unusual, a goblin lock with a keyhole that required the specific account key. But Harry put his hand flat on the door surface, the way he'd done with the sphere, and felt what the vault held. The same cold point. The fourth instrument, dormant now, the sphere's broadcast had reached everything within the range Sharpclaw had predicted, including this vault 3 floors below Hogsmeade. The instrument had deactivated. It's dormant, Harry said. It still requires the key to open, Griphook said. He produced a small silver key from his jacket, which Harry looked at. Emergency charter access key, Griphook said. Applicable to all vaults holding assets identified in the tribunal findings. You had that the whole time. I filed the relevant paperwork this morning before we left. Griphook paused. I anticipated this conversation. Harry looked at him. When? Thursday evening, about 30 seconds after you mentioned Charter 9 Article 2, Griphook said, with the neutral expression that meant he was privately satisfied with himself. You're predictable in your thoroughness. Harry felt something that was a complete and genuine laugh, which surprised him slightly, and he let it, because it was a day that had started in Hogsmeade feeling cold instruments in an ancient building and was going somewhere that required this. Open it, he said. Griphook opened the vault. The instrument was the only thing in it, sitting on a stone shelf, a small dark object about the size of a closed fist, made of something that looked like iron but had the wrongness of all dark artifacts, the subtle visual mistake of a thing that has been made to do something it shouldn't. It was dormant now, Harry's broadcast having done what it was built to do, and it looked in its dormancy like what it was, an old, ugly, purposeful thing made to hurt a specific person. Harry looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up, which made Griphook draw a sharp breath. It's dormant, Harry said. I can feel it. It's not active. Even dormant, Sharpclaw's going to want to examine it, Harry said. All 4, when we can get the ones from Hogwarts. But this one first. He held it and felt nothing, no resonance, no cold, no activation. Just a dead piece of purposeful iron. It's mine, Griphook. The tribunal said so. Griphook looked at the object in Harry's hand and then at Harry and then at the empty vault shelf, and he made a small sound that acknowledged several things simultaneously and said none of them. They came back up to find Ragnarok in the transit hall. This was not routine. Ragnarok did not meet people in the transit hall. Ragnarok sat at his granite desk and the world came to him, and if he was standing in the transit hall at 9 in the morning on a Saturday it meant something had happened. The ministry classification hearing has been moved to this morning, Ragnarok said. 45 minutes from now. Emergency session. Harry and Griphook looked at each other. How? Someone in Dumbledore's network learned you'd left for Hogsmeade this morning, Ragnarok said. They filed for emergency reclassification to prevent vault access before you returned. He paused. They are about to learn that emergency timing cuts both ways. He produced a roll of parchment from his robes. This is a formal notification to the Wisengamot's emergency session that the charter access has already been executed and the asset already recovered, which renders the classification hearing moot as a matter of law. He handed it to Griphook. It needs to be delivered to the clerk in 30 minutes. I'll go, Griphook said, already moving. Harry, Ragnarok said, and Harry stopped. The hearing is presided over by the Chief Warlock. Dumbledore will be present. Several of his supporters will be present. He paused. You have the right to appear as the petitioner. Harry looked at the parchment in Griphook's hand. Then at the dark object in his own hand. Then at Ragnarok with the iron-grey eyes that had never once been anything other than completely honest with him. I'll be there, Harry said. He was there in 20 minutes, which required the transit and a fast walk through ministry security and a brief argument with a clerk who had not expected the morning to develop this way and was not prepared for a 10-year-old with a dormant dark artifact and a Gringotts officer walking through the door of an emergency Gringotts session already in progress. The clerk stepped aside. The session was smaller than the full chamber. Emergency proceedings drew only sitting members who had been specifically notified, and on a Saturday morning that was perhaps 30 people in the lower tiers, plus Dumbledore at the advocate's position and 2 of his legal team and, to Harry's right as he entered, Augusta Longbottom standing at the back with her briefcase and an expression that meant she had also been notified and had arrived as fast as the transit could carry her. The chief warlock looked up from the session in progress. "This is an emergency classification hearing, I know," Harry said, walking to the petitioner's floor. "I'm the petitioner." Silence, except for Griphook, who was already presenting the notification parchment to the session clerk with the unhurried precision of someone filing documents they are extremely confident about. Dumbledore turned from the advocate's position. He looked at Harry, and he looked at the object in Harry's hand, and his expression performed nothing at all, just absorbed the information with the stillness of a man whose strategy has encountered reality and is taking the measure of the gap. "Charter 9 Article 2 access was executed this morning," Griphook said to the clerk, who was reading the notification with the expression of someone whose morning has gotten away from them. "The asset was recovered from Vault 317 at 8:42. The classification petition references a vault that no longer contains the asset the classification was filed to protect. The classification petition is therefore moot," Augusta said from the back, because she had read the situation as she walked in and she was already 2 steps ahead of it. "The session's purpose no longer exists." The chief warlock looked at the clerk. The clerk looked at the notification. "The petition references," he read, slowly, Vault 317, Trust Account T.M. Riddle, Thomas Marvolo Riddle. Registered beneficiary. He looked up. "The beneficiary is on record as deceased." The room went very still. Harry looked at the notation on the document. "Thomas Marvolo Riddle." "TMR Riddle," Harry said. The name was registering against things he'd read, archive records, history, the chapter in the Goblin History of Dark Magic that Griphook had assigned him at age 8 and which he'd read 4 times. Riddle. Marvolo, that's a Gaunt family name. Augusta had gone very still too. "The Gaunt family was connected to Slytherin line," Harry said. "Descendants of Salazar Slytherin. The last known heir was Marvolo Gaunt, who had a son." He stopped. He looked at the clerk's document. "Thomas Marvolo Riddle is Voldemort." The room moved, not physically, but in the way rooms move when a truth lands in them that everyone in them will remember exactly, the particular quality of a moment becoming fixed in time. Several members in the lower tiers had gone the specific color of people who have just understood something they wish they hadn't. Harry turned to Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at him with the expression from the Thursday meeting, the one that was genuine, that had fear in it, and the fear was not for himself. "Harry," he said quietly. "What was in that vault was being kept safe. The instrument was dormant, Riddle is gone, and without, the instrument is deactivated," Harry said. "Permanently. I did that this morning." He held it up, the dark iron object, dormant in his hand. "Along with the 3 at Hogwarts." Dumbledore looked at the object, and the expression shifted, the calculation running, the assessment updating, and underneath it, in the gap between what he'd planned and what had happened, something that was complex and genuine and not entirely comprehensible moved across his face. "You went to Hogwarts this morning," Dumbledore said. "I was in Hogsmeade," Harry said. "Close enough." "The instruments at Hogwarts were not only the ones Narcissa documented," Dumbledore said, and now his voice had a different quality, not warm, not managed, just direct, the voice of someone who has decided the situation is past the point where management is useful. "There are other things in that building connected to Voldemort's return. The instruments were a secondary concern." "There is," he stopped. "There is what?" Harry said. The room was absolutely still. "There is a piece of him," Dumbledore said. "In the school." I placed it there because I believed a controlled environment was the safest location until I understood what it was and how to deal with it. He met Harry's eyes. It's in your scar. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. I know, Harry said. The silence lasted 3 more. You know, Dumbledore repeated. Griphook told me Thursday night, Harry said. After you mentioned the fear about what's in the school. We talked about it Friday. Sharpclaw confirmed the technical basis Saturday morning. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. A fragment of a soul, attached to mine by the rebounding killing curse. I've known something was there since I was 7, I could feel it sometimes, a wrongness, separate from me. The instruments were going to amplify it. That's what they were actually for, isn't it? Not to hurt me directly. To strengthen the fragment. Dumbledore looked at him, and the expression was fully unguarded now, the warmth and the management and the careful framing all gone, and what was underneath was a man who was brilliant and genuinely committed to what he believed was right and who had built an entire architecture of decisions around the assumption that he was the only person who could manage what he knew, and was now looking at a 10-year-old who knew all of it. You were supposed to not know, Dumbledore said, and it was the most honest thing he had said in any room Harry had been in with him. Not because I was deceiving you. Because I believed the knowledge would hurt me, Harry said. Or change what I'd be willing to do about it. Yes. You thought I'd have to die. The words sat in the room like stones in still water. The soul fragment cannot be removed, Dumbledore said. Not by any method I have been able to identify. He stopped. I believe the only resolution would require your sacrifice, Harry said. That's a very old magical principle. Willing sacrifice. You've been building toward asking me to walk into a situation where I'd have to die so the fragment would be destroyed. He paused. Without telling me. Because you thought if I knew, I'd choose differently. Dumbledore said nothing. I'm 10 years old, Harry said, and his voice was very quiet, very clear, the quality it got when something was so serious that everything unnecessary had been stripped away. You were going to let me reach 17 and walk me into death without telling me, because you decided you knew better than I did what I would choose. He paused. And you also robbed me. And you put me in a cupboard. And you sold a dark instrument to people trying to hurt me. And you kept a piece of Voldemort in the school where children go. Another pause. And you believe all of it was for the greater good. I believe, Dumbledore said, carefully, that the greater good sometimes requires a conversation, Harry said. It requires honesty. It requires treating the people your decisions affect as people rather than variables. He looked around the room, the 30-odd members, Augusta at the back, Griphook at his left, Ragnarok standing in the doorway where he had arrived silently sometime in the last 5 minutes. I'm not going to die for a plan I wasn't consulted on. The fragment is a problem I'll solve, Harry said simply. On my terms, with complete information, when I'm ready. Not because someone has managed me into a position where I have no other choice. He looked at Dumbledore. Sharpclaw is already working on it. The same technical tradition that built the failsafe into those instruments understood soul magic. The pre-statute period understood a great deal about it. He paused. It's going to take time. But I have time. Dumbledore looked at him for a very long moment. And in that look was something that Harry did not mistake for admiration and did not mistake for defeat. It was something more complicated, the look of a man who had built a very long and very careful plan and was watching it become unnecessary in a way he had not anticipated and could not entirely dislike. You're extraordinary, Dumbledore said. I had good teachers, Harry said, and he meant Griphook, and he meant Ragnarok, and he meant Augusta, and he meant Rekka in the archive, and he meant Sharpclaw with his magnifying lens and his 60 years of expertise, and he meant Goldthorn and the morning exercises and the chess games and the atrium garden and 11 years in a building made of gold and honesty. What happens now? Dumbledore asked. The Wisengamot proceedings continue, Harry said. The DMLE investigation continues. The Goblin Tribunal findings stand. The estate is returned in full, including whatever Sharpclaw determines is recoverable. He paused. And you're going to cooperate with the investigation into TMR's soul fragment? Fully. Every piece of information you have. Because the way to deal with that problem is with complete information shared among people who are all working on it together, not managed from above by someone who knows best. And if I don't cooperate? Dumbledore asked, and the question wasn't defiant, it was genuine, the question of someone reassessing the terms. Then the international legal bodies that have the certified evidence package take the next step, Harry said. And I go back to Sharpclaw and we solve the soul fragment problem independently, which we can do, and when it's solved, Voldemort has no path back and whatever leverage you have in this room goes away. He paused. Or you cooperate, and we solve it together, and it still goes away, but we solve it faster and better and nobody has to manage anyone. He looked at him steadily. Those are the same outcome for me. Which one they are for you depends on what you choose. The Chief Warlock, who had been sitting in silence for the past 8 minutes watching the emergency classification hearing become something that was not anything in the procedural manual, said carefully, "Is the petitioner formally withdrawing the charter access notification?" "No," Harry said. "The notification stands. The vault is empty, the asset is recovered, and the classification petition is moot." He picked up the dormant instrument from where he'd set it on the petitioner's stand. "This goes to Sharpclaw. I'll have a full technical report within the month." He turned to go. "Harry," Dumbledore said. Harry stopped. "I am sorry," Dumbledore said. "For the cupboard. Whatever else is complicated or contextual, for that specifically, I am sorry." Harry stood still for a moment. He thought about a rainy night and a brass compass and a goblin who had opened a locked door and crouched down on the floor and said, "I'm going to get you out of here." "I know you are," Harry said. "It doesn't change what happened. But I know you are." He walked out. The corridor outside was quiet, the ministry's usual Saturday morning traffic, nobody knowing what had just happened in the room behind him. Griphook fell into step beside him without a word, and they walked toward the lifts together, and the morning was still grey outside the atrium windows, still the same unremarkable Saturday it had started as, except that 3 dark instruments in a school were now dormant, and one was in Harry's bag, and a soul fragment had been named and would be addressed, and the Ledger's story had been told publicly and completely and the telling was irreversible. In the lift, going up, Griphook said, "The Lestrange proceedings will take years." "I know. The full estate recovery will be complicated." "I know. The soul fragment is genuinely difficult." "Sharpclaw is optimistic but the work will be, Griphook," Harry said. "Yes. I know," Harry said. "All of it. I know." He looked at the lift doors. "Are you worried?" Griphook considered this with the honesty he had always applied to Harry's questions, the same honesty he'd applied since a rainy night 11 years ago when he'd decided that lying to children was efficient in the short term and counterproductive in the long term. "No," he said. "I'm not worried." "Why not?" "Because you're 11 years old and you just told the most powerful wizard in Britain exactly what's going to happen next, in his own building, in front of 30 witnesses, and you were completely right." He paused. "And because I've been watching you work since you were 3 years old balancing coins on a mattress, and I know what you're like when you've decided something." Harry looked at him. "What am I like?" "Like water through stone," Griphook said. "Which I believe I've thought before." The lift opened onto the atrium. They stepped out into the black floors and the golden fireplaces and the statue that was supposed to make people feel small, and Harry looked at it, and the morning light caught it at an angle that made it look, not smaller, not reduced, just ordinary, the way things look when you've stopped being impressed by them because you know what they actually are. "I want to see my mother's research notes," Harry said. "She was a potions researcher before she died, she had notebooks. The estate records mention them. They should be in the primary vault." "They are," Griphook said. "I verified the inventory last week. I want to read them." Then we'll go to the vault, Griphook said, and turned toward the fireplaces. Harry took one last look at the statue. Then he turned and followed Griphook, and the green flames took them, and they were gone, and the ministry atrium stood exactly as it always had, except that outside its walls things were different now, irrevocably and specifically and well-documentedly different, and in the corridors of the wizarding world and the tiers of the Wisengamot and the offices of 3 international legal bodies, the certified evidence sat in its binding and its seals and told its story to anyone who opened it, over and over, clear and complete and permanent as gold. In Gringotts, 7 floors below Diagon Alley, the primary Potter vault held everything that had not been taken, the things that had waited, patient and intact, for the Bloodright's heir to come and claim them. The cloak on its shelf. The research notebooks in their case. The artifacts that had never been touched. The gold that had simply sat and grown across 11 years of interest and waited to be Harry's. He opened the vault door with his hand, Bloodright's access, no key needed, and the light came on automatically, warm and gold, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it all. Then he went in.